So this is going to be a rather large app that we work on with a couple of different features in it. It's going to be a kind of Reddit clone, so kind of a social media discussion website. It's going to have authentication. Users are going to be able to log in, create posts, and then respond to each other's posts by adding comments and whatnot. In addition, all posts are going to belong to a topic, and these different topics should be browsable as well. On the home page right here, I want to show all of the different top posts, and our metric for top posts is going to be the post with the most comments. At the very top, we'll have a little search input. We'll have a sign up button on the top right-hand side. And then over here on the right-hand side, we'll have a listing of some of the different topics that have been created and a button to create a new topic. Whenever a user clicks on that button right there, it's going to pop up a little form like so, where a user can enter in a name and some description. Once they have created a topic, they'll then be taken to a page where they'll see all the posts that belong to the topic they just made. So in this case, we can imagine that if I made a new topic called JavaScript and I added in some description for it and clicked on submit right there, I should go to this JavaScript page that shows a bunch of posts that belong to the topic of JavaScript. And the description I added in should be displayed over here. If a user clicks on create post, we're going to show a modal window at the very center of the screen where they can enter in a title and some content for the post and then click on submit. Whenever a user views a post in particular, we're going to show this page right here. So this is to view a post. At the very top, we'll display the title of the post, the content, and then an immediate reply form. And then after that, we'll show all the different comments that have already been added. So the reply form right here is to add in a comment. Our comments are going to be nestable. So we can have a top level comment, and then someone can reply to that, and then someone can reply to this one, and so on. Whenever someone clicks on the little reply link right here, we're going to pop up a reply form right underneath that, like so. So user can very easily type in reply, click save, and then it will immediately show up on the screen. So that's it. Now, I want to tell you right away, this is a pretty large application. Even though there's only a handful of different screens here, there's a ton of very subtle, very small pieces of functionality, and we're going to do everything kind of right. In other words, we're going to add in a lot of validation to our forms. We're going to add in a lot of error handling. We're going to make sure that we do things in the way that I would expect you to do them on a real project. So even though this might look a little bit small, well, we're going to spend a lot of time on this and make sure that you understand every single aspect of it. Okay, so that's it. That's what we're going to be working on. Now to get started on this project, let's go and generate a new Next application right away back at our terminal. I'm back inside of my workspace directory, and I'm going to run that npx create next app at latest command. I'm going to call this project discuss. And then, as usual, we'll use all these defaults. All right, so when we come back in the next video, we're going to make sure we have our code editors open, and we're going to start going over some of the initial design for this project. I have generated my Discuss project, and I've got my code editor open inside this new project directory. In this video, I want to very quickly discuss 3 different libraries we're going to be using inside this project to implement some pretty major features and help us along. After we go over what these libraries are, we'll then go over the setup of each one in the coming videos. So let's get to it. Okay, so here's our Next server. Inside of our Next server, as I mentioned, we're going to use 3 different important libraries just to make our lives much, much easier. First, we're going to once again use Prisma, which is a library that makes it really easy to access a database. We're going to have our data still stored inside of a SQLite database. You can absolutely use a different kind of database here if you want. For example, if you want to use Postgres with Prisma, it's super easy and you pretty much don't really have to change a whole bunch besides some connection settings we hand off to Prisma. So we are just using SQLite because in this course, I don't want you to have to go through the process of installing Postgres. But again, you absolutely can if you want to. So once again, we need to do a little bit of Prisma setup. The Prisma setup this time is going to be a little bit more complicated because we're going to have a lot more kinds of data inside of our application. Next, we're going to be using a library called NextUI. This is a component library that is designed to work very nicely with Tailwind CSS. So our previous applications, they haven't looked that great. I mean, they haven't looked terrible, but they didn't look that great. So to save a lot of effort on styling and keep you from having to type in a ton of class names on a ton of JSX, we're going to use this NextUI library. So it's going to give us a lot of components we can just directly throw into our application and make it look kind of nice. The only downside to NextUI is that the installation is a little bit involved. That's it, but it's really not the worst thing. And then finally, we are going to need some authentication. So users should have the ability to sign up and sign out of our app. To handle authentication, we're going to use a library known as NextAuth. It's also known more recently, they've renamed, just so you know, to Auth.js. So they are the same library. You might know it as NextAuth. It is now known as Auth.js. This is going to handle everything related to authentication. So the ability to sign up, sign in, sign out, storing users in our database, fetching users, and telling us if the user is logged in when they make a request to us. All that kind of stuff is going to be handled by NextAuth. To actually sign users in and sign them up, we're going to be using GitHub OAuth. So that's going to be the classic sign in with GitHub kind of button that we're going to add in. All right, so that's it. Those are the 3 major libraries we're going to use. Each one requires a decent amount of setup. That's why I'm kind of prepping you here so that you understand what we're going to be doing over the next couple of videos. So let's get started with the setup for each of these in just a moment. The first dependency we are going to add into our project is NextUI. Now, unfortunately, we're not just installing a package here. We're going to install a package and change some configuration. And this is all required to use NextUI inside of a Next.js project. To get started, I'm going to open up my terminal, and we're going to install 2 separate packages into our project. So I'll do an npm install at nextui-org/react and framer-motion. Framer Motion is a library that is required by NextUI. That's why we are installing it. You and I are not going to use that directly. It's going to be used automatically by NextUI. So I'm going to install that. Then, like I said, that's not it. We've got a little bit more to get through here. I'm going to find the tailwindconfig.ts file inside of my root project directory. Inside of here, at the very top, we are going to add in an import for NextUI from at nextui-org/react. Then inside of this content array right here, we're going to add in another entry. So we will put in a string with /node_modules /at nextui-org theme dist ** dot, and then curly braces, JS, TS, JSX, and TSX. So what is that all about? Well, this entire section right here of content is telling Tailwind where to go to find all the different class names that we are using inside of our project. So you'll notice that we are telling Tailwind to go and look inside of our app directory and go and find all the different JavaScript, TS, JSX, TSX files inside there. Same thing with the components directory. And now we are adding in this new record right here to say, Tailwind, go and look into the NextUI directory inside of our node modules folder and find all of the JavaScript, TS, blah, blah, blah files inside there and read those files and pick out all the different class names from them. Next up, we're going to go down to the bottom. Right above plugins, we will add in dark mode of class. And then inside of the plugins array, we will add in NextUI and call it like a function. Okay, now really important, please just double check what you typed in right here. Make sure you've got the exact same thing as me. If you don't, then styling is just not going to work correctly inside of your project. Okay, so let's save this file. Next up, inside my src directory, in the app folder, I'm going to make a new file called providers.tsx. Inside of here, we're going to make a client component. I'm going to import NextUI provider from at nextui-org/react. I will then export default, a function called providers. This is going to receive some children. Let's put in a interface here just to describe that. So interface of providers children, and that will be of type react.react node. And then I will apply that interface right here. And let's actually call it providers props. That's better. Then I'm going to return next UI provider. And inside there, I'm going to place children like so. Okay, so what is this all about? Well, there are many components inside of Next UI that require state to work correctly. All this state is coordinated across your application using React context. This Next UI provider thing right here, that is kind of the mechanism that's sharing all this state throughout all of the different Next UI components that you are using. So this is going to be used by things like, say, modals and whatnot to make sure that different events, different pieces of state are shared across all these different components that we are using. Just creating this component isn't enough. We need to actually add it in to our layout file. So I'm going to open up layout.tsx. At the very top, we are going to add in import for providers, and that's our default export from @app providers. Then I'm going to go down. I'm going to find the body element right here. I'm going to give myself a little bit of space and then add in providers like so. So now the last thing we're going to do is a test and make sure all the stuff is working correctly. Inside of my page.tsx file, I'm going to delete the image import at the top, and I'll clear out all the JSX inside of here. I'm then going to import a component from the NextUI library. So I will import curly braces button from @nextui-org/react. And then inside of our homepage component, I'm going to place a div with button that says click me, like so. One other thing before we test this out, let's also open up that globals.css file and delete all that default CSS that's inside of here. So everything after those first 3 Tailwind imports. Okay, time to test this out. We'll open up our terminal, do a npm run dev, and then inside of our browser, after a little bit, it's going to take a long time to load this up the first time because there's a lot of code in that NextUI library. And we'll see, there we go, there's our button, and it's nicely styled. And this button doesn't really look that great, but we'll see over time that we can add in a lot of different props to these different components we're going to use from NextUI. And these different props are going to customize these components and actually end up making them look pretty darn nice. So I think you'll end up being pretty impressed or fairly happy with how this entire project looks by the end. Okay, so that's it. We got through the first little bit of setup. We've got NextUI wired up. In the text lecture right before this, you should have found a file for download called schema.prisma. Make sure you download that file. We're going to use it in just a moment. So as you probably guess, yeah, in this video, we're going to do a little bit of Prisma setup. To install Prisma, we're going to install the Prisma client library. We're then going to run a command that's going to initialize Prisma in our project by creating a couple of different files, one of which is going to be the schema or the prisma.schema file. All right, so to get started, I'm going to open up my terminal. I'm going to stop my running server with a Control-C. I'm then going to install Prisma into my project with a npm install Prisma. After that has been installed, I'll then initialize Prisma inside my project with a npx this time, Prisma init -- data source -- provider SQLite. Once you run that command, you should see a new folder inside of your project directory called Prisma. And inside there is the schema.prisma file. So this is what tells Prisma that we want it to connect to our SQLite database. This file is also used to tell Prisma about the different kinds of data or different structures we want to have inside of the database as well. The project we are currently working on is going to end up having a ton of different kinds of data inside this database, mostly because of the way that this NextAuth library works. And I'll tell you about all that in just a moment. So we essentially need to add in a ton of text into the schema.prisma file. And to save you a whole bunch of time and a whole bunch of typing, I've given you a schema.prisma file that has already been put together. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to delete the prisma.schema file that was automatically generated for us. And I'm going to drag and drop schema.prisma into that Prisma directory in our project. If you now open up the new schema.prisma file, you're going to see inside there, the top is still the same, but then underneath that, there is a tremendous amount of stuff being defined. So all these different models define different tables or collections of data that are going to exist inside of our SQLite database. As I mentioned, a lot of this is a hard requirement of Auth.js. And I'll go into all that in just a moment as we set up that library. So we're going to see there's things inside of here called accounts and sessions and users and verification tokens. That's all tied to Auth.js. And then after that, we're going to see that there are a couple of different models like topic and post and comment that are what actually belong to our application. So these are the different kinds of records we're going to store inside of our SQLite database to power our app. We're going to have a collection of topics, collection of posts, and a collection of comments. Once we have this schema.prisma file inside of here, we are then going to actually create our database by running npx prisma migrate dev. When you first run that command, you'll be asked to enter in a name for the migration. We're going to give this a name of just init. And then after that, we'll be told, okay, the database has been generated. So if we look now inside the Prisma folder, we should see dev.db. That's our SQLite database. So inside there, can't really see it, but all of our data is going to be stored inside. Next up, we're going to make it really easy to use the Prisma client inside of our project. So we're going to use the same technique we did in our last project. Inside of our src directory, we'll make a new folder called db. And then inside of that folder, we're going to make a file called index.ts. And at the top of this file, we'll import Prisma client from @prisma/client. We will then export a variable called db, and that's going to be a new Prisma client. So just like our last project, this db thing, this is an object, has a ton of different functions tied to it, and that's going to be the primary way in which we work with information inside of our database. So we are going to be importing that all over the place inside of our project, because it turns out we're going to need to access our database a whole bunch. All right, that's it for setup with Prisma right now. So now onto the last piece of setup. This one is going to be, again, a little bit involved, a little bit worse than NextUI maybe, but it won't be the worst thing. So let's start the setup of Auth.js in just a moment. The last big piece of setup we're going to do is around our authentication system. So we're going to go through the process of setting up NextAuth. Setting up our authentication system is going to take just a little bit of time because there's, well, a lot of steps to it. So I've broken this down into several different steps we're going to go through. In this video, we're going to try to get through steps 1, 2, and 3. Along the way, I'm also going to explain a little bit of some behind the scenes stuff with OAuth, just in case you've never made use of it before. So I'm going to eventually show you the entire OAuth flow with a nice big diagram and explain everything that's going on behind the scenes. Okay, so first little bit of setup here. All of our authentication is going to flow through GitHub OAuth. That means we're going to have a classic sign in with GitHub kind of button in our application. To use GitHub to provide authentication, we have to provide or create a OAuth app on GitHub's website. So you will need your own GitHub account here to set this up. Make sure you have created a GitHub account. Once you've done so, we're going to navigate to this address you see right here to create a new OAuth application. So back inside my browser, here's that link right here. We're going to create our new OAuth app. Once we do so, we're going to get back a client ID and a client secret. These are two pieces of information that are going to identify our app to GitHub servers when we try to sign a user in. We'll enter in an application name of dev discuss, and I'm calling it dev just to indicate to myself that this is the development version of the OAuth application. If we ever went over to production, we deploy our app to production, we would create a separate set of authentication keys through GitHub's website, just to make sure that we've got separate resources for development and for production. Then our homepage URL will be http:// localhost 3000. And then down here, authorization callback URL. This is a super important piece of info to type in. So make sure you get the exact same thing as I. We're going to enter in exactly http:// localhost:3000/API auth callback GitHub. And please double check that. If you do not have the exact same thing as me, you're going to end up seeing an error later on, and it's going to be a really mysterious error that's going to be really hard to debug. Okay, once you've got that in, go ahead and register application. So here's our app, and right away, I'll be presented with my client ID. We need to generate a client secret, which we can do by clicking on the Generate Client Secret button right there. Once I click on it, there's my client secret. Okay, now that we have these two pieces of information, we're going to add them into a new environment file inside of our project that we're going to call .env.local. I'm going to go create that file inside my editor right away. So in the root project directory, .env.local. Then we will define 3 different environment variables: GitHub client ID, GitHub client secret, and auth secret. And they must be spelt exactly like the way you see right here in all capital letters. So I'm going to add in GitHub client ID, GitHub client secret, and auth_secret. I'm then going to fill in each of these. So I'll go back over to the GitHub page and find the client ID and copy paste it in. Here's my client ID. I'll copy it, paste it in. Here's my client secret. I'll copy it and paste it in. And it did not copy there. Let me try that again. That's better. And then finally, the auth secret just has to be a random series of numbers and letters. So we could put in anything here. I'm just going to enter in a bunch of gibberish, and that's going to work just fine. Okay, so that is step 2. Now on to step 3. To get Auth.js working inside of our project, we have to install 3 separate packages. Now, for better or worse, Auth.js has a little bit of a reputation of breaking every now and then. I have not quite seen this same behavior, but it is in very active development. So just to make sure that your app works the exact same way as me, I'm going to ask you to please install the same exact version of packages that I'm showing here. So we're going to use Auth Core at version 0181, Prisma Adapter at 106, and NextAuth at 500 beta-3. So I'm going to do a npm install with all these. In my terminal, I will npm install with a --save-exact. It's going to make sure you get exactly the same version, and I'll put in all 3 of those packages. Let me zoom in a little bit more just to make it super clear. So make sure you've got Auth Core, Auth Prisma Adapter, and NextAuth. Once you've got that all in there, let's do the install. And after a moment or two, there we go. Installation complete. Well, that is kind of the easy part of setup. So we've gotten through steps 1, 2, and 3. And we'll take a pause, come back with 4, 5, and 6. And again, I still owe you a big explanation. Totally optional. You might already know how OAuth works, but totally optional. You can hear me talk about OAuth for a little bit in a moment or two. On to step number 4. We're going to make a file called auth.ts inside of our src folder. This file is going to be the central point where all of our authentication stuff and utilities are going to exist. So we're going to end up exporting a lot of stuff from this auth.ts file and using it across our application in order to sign the user in, sign them out, and determine whether or not they are signed in at all. To get started, inside of my editor, I'm going to find my src directory, and in there, I will make auth.ts. Then at the top, a couple of different imports. I will import NextAuth from Next-Auth, GitHub from Next-Auth, providers, GitHub, and curly braces Prisma Adapter from @auth/Prisma adapter, Prisma-adapter, there we go. And then finally, our Prisma client. So curly braces DB from @/DB. Now I want to very quickly tell you about this Prisma adapter thing. Whenever a user signs into our application or signs up for the very first time, we need to store some information in our database about them. So in some database somewhere inside of our project, we need something that stores a list of all of our different users and what their username is, their avatar picture posted on github.com, and so on. We only have one database inside of our project. It's our SQLite database, and we access that through the Prisma library. You might recall that when we made our Prisma directory a little bit ago and we created the schema.prisma file inside there, I told you about all these different models that were defined inside of here, such as account and session and user and verification token. These are all used automatically by this Prisma adapter library. So whenever a user signs up for the very first time, this Prisma adapter thing is going to automatically reach into our database and try to create a new user record. And it's required that this user record has a couple of very specific properties assigned to them, such as a name, email, email verified, image, accounts, and sessions. So whenever a user signs up for the first time, that Prisma adapter is going to try to create a new user record with specifically these properties. So if we were to change the name of any of these properties, we would end up getting an error from that Prisma adapter library. Obviously, you're going to probably need to type out all this stuff on some future project. When you do, you will go over to the documentation for Prisma adapter, and they will tell you exactly what schema you need inside this schema.prisma file to work with the Prisma adapter. Okay, so after that big aside, let's continue with our setup here. Now I'm going to reach into our environment variables file, really just our local environment variables, and pick out that client ID and that client secret. So I will say GitHub client ID is process env.github client ID, and GitHub client secret is process env GitHub client secret. Whenever you pull a property off the process environment object, TypeScript thinks that this thing is going to be either a string or undefined. So we're going to immediately check these variables and make sure they actually are defined. And if they're not, we'll immediately throw an error and say, make sure you define these environment variables, because otherwise all the authentication stuff in our application is not going to work correctly. So for that, we'll say if not GitHub client ID, or if not GitHub client secret, then go ahead and immediately throw an error with some message like missing GitHub OAuth credentials. All right, next up, down here, we're going to do our big setup call to the NextAuth object. This is what is going to be our primary kind of setup location of NextAuth, and over time, we're going to add in more and more configuration options to it. When we call NextAuth, we're going to put in a configuration object. We're going to add in a lot of options to it, and this NextAuth thing is going to return an object that we're going to destructure out a bunch of properties from, and then export and use across our entire application so that, again, we can figure out how to sign a user in, sign them out, and whether or not the user is signed in at all. First, let's take care of this configuration object. We're going to add in an adapter, a Prisma adapter with DB. Providers, that's going to be an array with GitHub. We'll put in an object there with a client ID. And notice the D on here is lowercase, of GitHub client ID, and a client secret of GitHub client secret. Next up, after providers, I'm going to add in callbacks with an object that has async session. This session function right here is going to be called whenever we try to verify who a user is in our application. In a normal NextAuth project, you would not need this. But right now, in the current latest version of NextAuth, there's a little bit of a bug, and one very particular property on the user object does not get populated as it should. So this right here, I'm just going to add in a comment so you can remember this in the future. Usually not needed, Here we are fixing a bug in NextAuth. And let's just write in the code for it. I'm going to get session and user. I'm going to destructure them out. I'm going to annotate this as type any with TypeScript, just because, again, this is temporary. Usually you would never need to do this. And I'll say if there is a session and there is a user, then set session.user.id to user.id, and then return the session object. So the bug here is specifically the user object, the thing that tells us information about the person who is currently making a request to us, does not get the ID property assigned to them. So we can't actually identify the person who is trying to access our app, which is a huge, big problem, obviously. So it's just going to fix that little bug. Again, should not be needed at some point in time in the future once NextAuth releases a fix. All right, next up, we have configured NextAuth, and as I mentioned more than once now, this thing is going to give us back an object, and we want to export a couple of properties off that object. So we're going to put in export const right here, and we're going to destructure out a couple of things. We are going to destructure out handlers. That's going to be an object from which we are going to also destructure get and post. After the get and post, I'm going to close that object, and we're going to also get auth, sign out, and sign in. This handlers thing right here, this is related to our OAuth setup. So eventually we're going to call these request handlers. That's what they are. They're request handlers. They're going to be called automatically by GitHub servers whenever a user tries to sign into our application. The auth function is going to allow us to figure out whether or not a user is signed into our application inside of a React component. And sign out and sign in, those are functions. I bet you can guess what they do. We're going to call them to sign a user out or sign them in. So over time, we'll get used to all these different variables right here. Okay, so that is, what are we on now? Step 4? Yeah, that's step 4. So quick pause right here. We'll do step 5 and 6. On to step 5. Initially, this step right here is going to be a little bit mysterious, but we're going to go through the setup, and then I'm going to show you this big explainer diagram over here to help you understand how OAuth works in general. And that's going to explain exactly what's going on in step 5. So first, a little bit of mysterious setup. Inside of our app directory, we're going to make a folder called API. Inside there, we'll make a folder called auth. Inside there, we'll make a folder called square brackets ... NextAuth. And then inside there, we'll make a file called route.ts. Inside of that, we'll write out just a little bit of code, the smallest bit imaginable. So let's go through that setup right away. Back inside my editor, I'm going to find that src app directory. And again, we're going to make a bunch of folders inside of here. They're all going to be nested. So I'm going to do a API folder. Inside there, I will make a auth folder. Inside of that, I'm going to make a folder called square bracket ... NextAuth square bracket. And notice that auth here is lowercase. And then finally, inside that file, route.ts. A route.ts file inside of your app directory is another one of these very specially named files. If you ever define a file called route.ts, you can export functions from it called capital G get, or capital all letters get, and post. These implement API request handlers inside of your Next app. So if you ever have some outside web service that needs to talk to your Next application, you can create a route handler like this to build a GET request handler and a POST request handler. We usually do not have to create these whenever we are just working within a Next app with React code directly inside of here. Because if we ever need to reach out to our server to change data or get data, we usually use server actions instead. So generally, we don't have to create route handlers like this for our own personal use. We only have to create them whenever we need some outside server to access our app programmatically. And that's exactly what's going on here. The GitHub servers are going to try to reach out to our application to handle authentication at specific points in time. Okay, so I'm going to delete those because we don't need to define these ourselves. Instead, we are going to export those get and post functions from @/auth. So you might recall that inside of auth.ts, that file we just created, we had exported the get and post handlers. So we are importing and simultaneously exporting them from this file. And as you guessed, as I just mentioned, this is going to define some route handlers that GitHub servers can use to interact programmatically with our server. So that's all we have to do inside of here. We don't need any other code inside this file besides that. All right, so now at this point in time, we're going to do a completely optional little side talk here about how OAuth works in general. If you are already familiar with OAuth, that's totally fine. You can skip, you can pause this video right now and go to the next video. Otherwise, if you want to get a little bit better idea of what goes on behind the scenes whenever a user clicks on that sign in with GitHub button, then stick around and I'll tell you all about that right now. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to start up here. User clicks on the sign up button inside of our application. Whenever that occurs, the user's browser, of course, is going to make a request off to our backend server. We're going to realize that the user is trying to sign up to our application. So we're going to redirect them over to GitHub servers. So the user's browser completely redirected over to GitHub server. And in that redirection, we're going to include our client ID, that client ID that we had created when we made a GitHub OAuth app. So the user's browser is going to navigate automatically to an address that looks like this right here. Then on GitHub servers, they're going to receive the user's request, and GitHub is going to present a page to them asking that user if they are okay sharing information with our application. And if the user says yes, they click, yep, I'm okay, share my information. I do want to authorize this next server to access my profile. GitHub is going to redirect the user's browser back over to our application. When they redirect us, or the user's browser, it's going to be redirected to that address that we put into that OAuth config field when we were setting up our GitHub stuff. Quick reminder on where that is. So here's the GitHub app page, and down here at the bottom, we had filled out that authorization callback URL. So that authorization callback URL, this is where it gets used. So when the user gets redirected back over to our server, this is where the user gets redirected to. Whenever the user gets redirected to this route, that Auth.js route handler that we just set up a moment ago, that's going to receive this request. When it gets called, that route handler gets called, it's going to receive a query string parameter of code. Our server is then going to take that code property automatically, and it's going to make a follow-up request to GitHub. Now, one thing I want to clarify up here, these first two requests, these arrows right here, these are requests being made by the user's browser. But after this, everything else is communication directly between our server and GitHub. So this is a request made from our server specifically off to GitHub servers. So we're going to make a follow-up request to GitHub servers. And inside that request, we're going to include our client ID, our client secret, and that randomly generated code property. GitHub is then going to take a look at those three properties and make sure they're valid. And if they are valid, then it's going to respond to our server with something called an access token. This access token is what allows us to access information about the user. So we can get out of their profile things like their name, their email, their profile image, and stuff like that. In order to get that information, we have to make another request off to GitHub servers. And inside that request, we include an authorization header that includes the access token that we were just given. In response to that request, GitHub is going to send back the user's profile to us. So again, things like their name, email, their image URL, and so on. Once we get this information, that Prisma adapter is going to take it and automatically create a new user record in the database. That's what's going to store information about the user in our app. And then after that, we still need some way to kind of identify this user whenever they make a request to our server. To do so, we send a cookie back to the user's browser. This cookie is going to include some information securely encrypted about the person who's making a request to us. Whenever the user's browser makes a follow-up request, that cookie data is going to be included automatically. NextAuth is going to read in that cookie data, figure out who's making a request to us, and then modify the incoming request a little bit so the rest of our application can understand exactly who is making this request. So that's it. That's the entire OAuth flow. Essentially, it's a bunch of kind of jumps back and forth between our server and GitHub server. Now, all the stuff in here is being handled 100% by NextAuth. So we don't really have to deal with any of this stuff at all. with the sole exception of making sure that we correctly define that callback right here. So that is our authorization callback. That's this one right here. If that gets messed up, then this step right here is going to fail. Like I said, ends up being kind of hard to debug and figure out what's going on. Okay, so now that we kind of understand a little bit behind the scenes, very last thing we need to do here is a little bit of setup, last piece of setup here, and it's technically optional, but we're going to do it in our project. I'll explain step 6 in just a moment. Last piece of setup we're going to go through is making some server actions that we can call to sign in or sign out the user. And this is not strictly required, but I just really recommend you do it because user's authentication state really is kind of a piece of data in our application. And it's some piece of data that's going to change over time. So if you make a standalone file that has some very clearly defined server actions inside of it that very clearly say, hey, if you call this, you can sign in or sign out the user, other engineers on your project are going to see these server actions very easily and understand, oh, I can call these functions if I ever want to sign the user in or sign them out. Again, not strictly required, just kind of makes it really easy for everyone on your project to understand how to manipulate the user's authentication state. Okay, so to get started, back inside of my editor, in the src directory, I'll make a new folder called actions, and then inside there, a file called index.ts. I'm going to mark all the functions I define here as server actions by putting in that string of use server at the top. Then underneath that is a quick reminder from our auth.ts file that we worked on previously. This thing exports functions called sign out and sign in. So those ultimately are the functions that we need to call to sign the user in or sign them out. We are just going to take those functions and wrap them up inside of our server actions. Again, as you can tell, not required at all. I just really recommend you do this because, again, it makes it really clear to other engineers what's going on. So back over inside of index.ts, at the top, I'm going to import star as auth from @/auth. I'll then make an async function called sign in. And whenever I call this server action, I'm going to return auth.signin. So that is the function that gets exported from that auth.ts file. And whenever we call sign in, we have to pass in a string indicating what provider we want to sign in with. So we can have multiple OAuth providers inside of a single application. In this case, for our application, we've only got one. We have GitHub, so I'm going to specify that right here. Then I'll make a second function called sign out. And whenever I run this one, I'll do an auth.signout, like so. And that's it. Okay, so we have completed setup. Now, we haven't actually tested anything just yet, but I just want to kind of pause here and say it's kind of everything that goes into initially setting up authentication. So we're going to come back in just a moment, and we're going to actually test this out. And there are really 4 things, or maybe, 4 things I think in total that we need to do. We need to make sure we could sign in. We need to make sure we can sign out. Then we need to make sure that we can figure out whether or not the user is signed in inside of a server component and a client component. So that's what we're going to figure out in just a moment. Authentication setup is all done. So now we're going to go over these 4 very critical actions, 4 things you're going to want to do in just about every application related to authentication. So we're going to take a look at how we can sign in or sign up a user, how to sign them out, and then how to check to see if a user is signed in from a server component, and how to check and see if a user is signed in from specifically a client component. First, we'll take care of just signing in or signing up a user. To do so, inside of any component, be it a server component or a client component, we'll create a form. Whenever a user clicks on or submits that form, we're going to run the server action of sign in. And that's pretty much it. Let's try implementing this inside of our page.tsx file right away. Back inside of my app directory, I'll find page.tsx. At the top, I'm going to import star as actions from @/actions. I'll then place a form with a action of actions.signin, and the button needs a type of submit to make sure that it actually causes the form to be submitted whenever a user clicks on it. I'll then save this. Let's go back over to the browser and test it out. So now I'm going to click on the Click Me button. And whenever you click on it for the very first time, you're going to be taken to a page where you'll be asked to authorize your user account with the OAuth application we just created. This is the second time I'm recording this video, so I already saw that screen previously, but once you see it once, you don't see it again, and that's why I don't see it whenever I click on the button. But you should now be, in theory, signed in to the application. Next up, if we ever want to sign out a user, almost the same exact thing. We'll place a form. Whenever a user submits the form, we'll call the sign out action. Let's try adding that in. So back over here, I'm going to copy the form. I'll change the action for the second form to sign out and the button text to sign out. Let's also change the button text on the first one to sign in, just to be a little bit more clear. Okay, so now if we save this and flip back over, I see sign in and sign out. And if I click on sign out, well, in theory, I'm signed out from the application, but, well, we can't tell. So we can't really tell until we try to access the user's authentication status. So that's where these other two operations are going to come into play. So to check and see if a user is signed in or generally authenticated, we need to do something slightly different depending upon whether we are in a server component or a client component. It's really easy in a server component. In a server component, we're going to import the auth function from the auth.js file we had created. Then we can call that and we get back a session object. That session object might be null, so we're going to make sure it's actually defined by putting a little question mark like that right there. And then to see if a user is actually signed in, we look at the user property. The user property is an object that has some information about this user that is stored in our database, like their ID, their name, their email, and so on. So let's test this out really quickly. Back inside of my page, at the top, I will import auth from @/auth. Notice we've got curly braces on there. I'm going to put the async keyword on my component. I'll then get my session with await auth, like so. And now if you mouse over session, you'll notice that it tells us that this is either going to be a session object or possibly null. So we need to make sure that the session is actually defined. Just keep that in mind when you're writing your own code. Now I'm going to go down a little bit underneath the two forms. And I'm going to take a look at session ?.user. So if this is defined, then I want to print out a div that says signed in. Otherwise, a div, there we go, that just says signed out. And notice I'm using a ternary expression here, so I got a question mark right there and a colon over here. Let me make sure you can see that entire line. The question mark right here, just make sure that the session object is defined. If it's not, this entire expression right there will be evaluated to false, and I'll automatically jump to the div over here. Okay, let's save this and do a test. So right now I'm signed out. If I click on the sign in button, I will see signed in. Very good. And just for education purposes, because we're going to eventually need to take a look at this, the user property, as I mentioned, it is an object that has information about the user. So I'm going to replace signed in right here with JSON in curly braces, json.stringify session.user. So this will print out all the information about the user on the screen. We usually wouldn't do this on a normal application. It's just for demonstration purposes. So now if I take a look at this, here's my user object. Now, as I mentioned, I've got my name, my email address, and then a image property. And this image property is coming from GitHub right there. So that's my GitHub image. And then finally, I've got the ID. As a reminder, we have a little workaround right now inside that auth.ts file. Here's auth.ts. We put in that callbacks object with that session function right there. The whole goal of the session function was to really just get this ID property right here. If we didn't have that callbacks object with the session function in there, we would not see ID, and that just makes it really hard to work with a lot of data in a lot of places in our app. So again, that's why we put that little callback option in. All right, so we have gone over how to see if a user is signed in from a server component. So now the last step, last variation, we need to be able to check and see if a user is signed in from a client component. Whenever we want to do this, we have to do a little bit of one-time setup in our project. We have to set up something called a session provider inside of our providers.tsx file. This session provider is using React's context system to share information about whether or not the user is signed in throughout all the client components in our application. So that's what this one-time setup is doing. Let's go through that setup really quickly, and I'll show you the code down here after that. So inside of our source app providers.tx file, at the very top, we will import session provider from Next.Auth/React. Then down here, I'm going to place some parentheses. I don't know why I keep getting that pop up. I'm just going to close it. And I'm going to put it down here, session provider, like so. Now make sure you did not accidentally leave a semicolon at the end of the line over here. If you do so, you're going to see a semicolon print up in the browser. Okay, so now that we've gone through that, we can make use of this new hook called useSession. We are going to import this thing from NextAuth.React. Then we're going to use it in a client component to get access to the session object. Now here's something a little tricky. When we make use of the auth function inside of a server component, as we did right here, we get back a session object that might be null. And if it's not null, it's going to have a user property that's going to contain information about the user. When we make use of the useSession hook, however, the data type or the value that gets returned is slightly different. We're going to get back a object that's always going to be defined. So we always are guaranteed to get a object here. And then the actual session data is available on a .data property, which might be null. And then inside there might be a user property. And that user property is only going to be defined if the user is signed in. So just remember, very slight difference between the two. In one case, it's pretty much just session.user. In the other, it's session.data.user. And in both cases, some things might be null, some things might not. At the end of the day, if you try to access this user data incorrectly, specifically this user property, TypeScript is just going to complain at you, and that's going to be your sign of, oh, I need to play around with this a little bit and make sure I'm accessing the user data correctly. All right, so let's make a client component inside of our project. We'll call it profile. It'll just access user's data and then print out signed in or signed out. Inside of my src directory, I'll make a new folder called components. Inside of that, I'm going to make a file called profile.tsx. I'm going to mark this as a client component, and then export default function profile. I need to use that hook inside of here, so I will import useSession from NextAuth/React. I'll then get my session object by calling the useSession hook, and I'll take a look at session.data. That might be undefined, so again, I'm going to put in the question mark, and then access user. I'll then return a div that says from client, user is signed in. Otherwise, if a user is not signed in, I'll return a div down here that says from client, user is not signed in. Let's then show this component inside of our page file. Back inside of page.tsx, at the very top, I will import profile from @/components profile. And then down at the very bottom, right above our closing div, I'll place my profile component. All right, at long last, time for a test. So back over here, I'll see from client, user is signed in, and you will need to refresh, by the way, the first time you do this. So from client, user is signed in. If I click on sign out, I'm told user is not signed in. And if I sign back in, I'll be told user is signed in. By the way, you will notice that there's a little bit of kind of like a jump there. So initially, our client code is fetching the authentication status from our backend server. So when we first show this page, for a little bit, we just don't have any user data. And so we see that little quick flash saying user is not signed in. And then as we get the user data, that client component is updated and it's resolved to say, hey, in fact, yeah, the user is truly signed in. Now, the last thing I want to show you really quickly, back inside of our profile component, just as before, what information is inside of this user property? Well, to check that out, I'm going to replace user is signed in with curly braces, JSON stringify, session, data, user. Save that back over here. Now it's a little bit messy to see, but I've got from client right there, and then the exact same user object that I have access to on the server. Okay, so that's it. I apologize for the long video, but I want to put all this stuff in one single video so that you understand if you ever need to refer back to this again, you understand how to sign in, sign out, see if we're signed in on a user or a server component or a client component. Well, we've got our authentication system set up, and we, I think, really understand how to figure out whether or not the user is signed in, sign them in and out, and so on. So now we're going to continue on with the rest of our application. We're going to kick this phase off by doing a little bit of upfront design. So I've put together some steps that I really recommend you go through whenever you are getting started on your own Next application. This is a lot more initial design than you might do on any other typical app. So let me first clarify exactly why I recommend you go through these steps whenever you start off with a new project. I want you to think about something we just ran into at the end of the last section as we went to run our application in production mode. We saw really quickly that we had some very strange behavior whenever we started to deploy our app thanks to this full route cache mechanism. So we had to go back through our code base and identify all the locations where our data would change, and then call that revalidate path function so that we can tell our server when it's running in production mode to go and re-render some specific page, thanks to some data that was being displayed on it changing. So it turns out that this entire caching mechanism and kind of accommodating for this when you go to deploy your application is really challenging. Like, in other words, you don't want to put this step off to the very end of your project because you're going to write all your code, you're going to run in development mode, you're going to think everything is working just fine, and then you're going to go to deploy and realize, oh yeah, that full route cache stuff. And you're going to have to go back over all of your code base and add in a ton of revalidate path function calls and whatnot to fix up all this caching stuff. So dealing with this caching system is just unbelievably easy if you go through this initial design process, and it's really, really hard if you try to do it at the very end. There are some other big benefits to this design process that we'll go through as we walk through each step. So let's give this a shot just for this one project. Once we go through it, I think you'll agree, hey, this really isn't the worst thing, and it really does make the rest of the project easier. So, all right, enough talking. Let's get to step one. Step one, we're going to take a look at our mockups, and we're going to identify all the different routes that we want our application to have. And on each of those different mockups, we're going to figure out exactly what data is being displayed on the screen. So let's get to it. We're going to write all this out into a table. So we're going to have some names for each of our different pages, a path for each, and then the data that is shown on each one. Just kind of a quick summary of the data. Okay, so back to the mockups over here. First off is our homepage. Well, on the homepage, we want to display this whenever a user goes to our root route of just /. And then as far as data being displayed, we've got a whole bunch of posts being displayed and a bunch of topics over here as well. Remember, posts belong to some particular topic. So I'm going to go back over to my chart and fill out some information about this first page. So my page name for this very first one is homepage. My path is just /, it's my homepage. And then the data shown here is many posts, many topics. Okay, that was easy. Let's move on to the next one. So the next page here is not really a separate page. This is just still the same homepage. I just meant to indicate that this is a little pop-up menu that appears whenever a user clicks on that new topic button right there. So not really its own distinct page or anything like that. So we can skip over this mockup. Next one right here, view a topic. So whenever I go to a particular topic, like let's say JavaScript, I want to show all the posts that belong to that topic. And I want to show this whenever a user goes to a route of something like topics / and then the name of the topic right there. So let's fill this out. I'm going to call this one topic show. And I want to display this anytime I go to a route of something like topics slash JavaScript, and not really JavaScript per se. I want this to be the name of the topic. So we probably want this to be a wildcard because we might have topics like JavaScript. We might have another one like development, or maybe web dev, topics slash next, or whatever else. So we should probably use a wildcard here. And then we could use something like topic name as the wildcard string we put in there. A very common way of referring to these kind of summarized names of a resource is slug. You might have seen that before. So very often we will refer to some URL encodable name like this right here as the slug, as opposed to the name. And that's what we're going to use in our application. So this route is going to be displayed whenever a user goes to topics slash wildcard, and the name of the wildcard will be slug. Okay. Next up, data shown on this page. Well, I think we're showing a single topic and many posts. Okay, almost done here. Next up, the create a post page. Whenever a user goes to topics slash some slug slash post slash new, I want to show this modal. And on this page, in the background, I still want to display all the posts and the topic as well. So let's add this one in. I'm going to call this create a post. I want to display it whenever a user goes to topics slash slug slash post slash new. And just like the last one on this page, I'm going to display a single topic and many posts. And then finally, onto our last page, view a post. So we'll display this whenever a user goes to topics, some slug, posts slash the ID of the post. And then on this page, we're going to display information about the post itself and all the comments that belong to that post as well. Okay, so that's our last one. So I'll add in show a post. I want to display this whenever a user goes to topics, slug, posts, and then that's going to be a wildcard right there as well, because we're going to have many different post IDs, of course. So I'll call this one post ID. And then on this page, we're going to display a single post and many comments. Okay, so there is our route information. Put all this together up front. So now let's take a pause and we'll move on to step 2 in just a moment. Let's move on to step 2, where we are going to create some path helper functions. Let me first explain what these are and why they are incredibly useful inside of any medium to large size project. Okay, let's imagine we are working on our project and we end up with some pretty nested folder structure like this right here inside of our app directory to define all of these different paths. Then across our code base, we're going to have to link to these different pages from link components, or maybe whenever we call the revalidate path function to deal with caching. And inside of each of these, we're going to have to write out a path, like say topics, and then the slug of a topic, and then post new, and whatever else. And that will just be kind of all over the place inside of our code base. Let's then imagine that at some point in time, maybe for some very important reason, we decide we have to change all the paths in our application. Maybe we want to have content be the very first part of the URL or the path. So we would create a content folder inside of our app directory and then place all of our deeply nested folders inside that content directory. So what would this change do to our project? Well, we would have to go around to all of our different links and add in /content at the start. So right there, and go around to all of our revalidate path calls and add in /content at the start as well. Now, as you'd imagine, having to hunt through our code base and find all of these different links and revalidate path and update the paths for all of them, that would be a nightmare, and I would not want to do that by hand. So instead, we are going to make some path helper functions. So here's an example right here. This is going to be a very simple set of functions that are going to have some kind of very clear name for each of them, for each of the different routes in our application. So maybe something like homepage and topic show path and post create path, post show path, and so on. They might take in some arguments and then use those arguments to return some specially crafted path to some different page in our application. Now we can use these in all of our different link components and revalidate path calls. So for example, this one up here was trying to go to topics topic.slug/posts/new. Instead of writing that out manually, we could instead call paths.postCreatePath and then put in the slug of the topic we are trying to go to. So it would end up being something like this. Paths.postCreatePath, and then put in topic.slug, or however we reference the name of a topic. Now that's a lot easier to write out and read inside of our code base. We're probably not going to add any accidental typos inside there because TypeScript will catch them. And now, if we ever decide to change all of the routes inside of our application in any way, rather than go around to all of our different components, we just have to go to this one single file and add in, say, /content right there. And as soon as we add that in, boom, all of the different links in our application are updated and all the different revalidate path calls are updated as well. So as you can imagine, using these path helpers, very nice on any medium to larger size project. On a really small project, you just have like very few pages, probably not needed. I think beyond just the number of pages, it also comes down to how many link elements you have. The project we're working on right now, it only has a couple of pages, but you're going to see really quickly that we have link elements and revalidate path calls all over the place in our application. So using this technique is going to save us a whole bunch of time. Okay, so hopefully I've got you sold. Hopefully you're on board. So let's create a set of path helpers for our project in just a moment. All right, my friends, let's create some path helpers using all those routes we just put together inside this table. So for right now, we're going to make 4 different path helpers. They're all going to be super simple and super straightforward. Over time, we're going to realize that we need 1 or 2 additional, but we'll get to those in due time. So let's just create some path helpers for these for right now. All right, so to get started, inside of my src directory, I'm going to make a new file called paths.ts. I'll then make a paths variable. It's going to be an object. And at the very bottom, I will export default paths. Then inside of here, I'm going to enter in some names for the different pages that I want to have inside my application. And these don't really have to be precise. You can use whatever structure you want. It's totally up to you. For us, we clearly have a home page, a page where we show a topic, where we create a post, and where we show a post. So I think maybe we could do something like home path, and that'll be a function. We could do a topic show path, maybe a post create path, and a post show path. Putting the word path on the end of each of these is a little bit unnecessary. If you want to, you could definitely reduce it down to be just something like that. So now to call each of these, it would be like paths.home, paths.topicshow, paths.postcreate, and so on. I kind of like this a little bit better, so I think maybe I'll stick with this. So now for each of these, all we have to do is take in some arguments and then return a string that will navigate a user off to some particular route. So for our homepage, it would be just return / for topic show. We want to return a string of /topic / some wildcard. So I'm going to assume that whenever I call topic show right here, I'm going to put in the topic slug. Remember, that's like the shortened name of a topic. Slug is a term that we use in web development just to indicate a URL safe name of some resource. So it really is just a plain name. Then in this case, we could return /topics / topic slug. And then I know I'm kind of confusing things by switching between diagram and code editor. So let's do it one more time here for post create and post show. On post create, we want that path right there. And for post show, we want a path like that right there. So let's fill those out. On post create, it'll be topic slug. That'll be a string. And this will take us to topics, topic slug, post new. And then on post show, we need a topic slug and a post ID. And that'll be topics, topic slug, post ID. And that's it. So that's a lot of typing, but we only have to do it one time in our project. Now, whenever we need a path to some different page, or whenever we want to call revalidate path, we can use these very easy to use functions instead. Okay, so that's it for step 2. Now, like I said, we're going to eventually come back and add in some additional path helpers, but only once we realize that we actually need them. So on to step 3 in just a moment. On to step 3. So this one is pretty obvious and fairly easy. Based upon all the routes we came up with during step 1, we're going to create our routing folders. So we're going to make a bunch of folders inside of our app directory, and we're going to start to create our different page.tsx files. We will create components inside of each one, but right now they'll just be very simple functions that return a single div that just says on the post show page or whatever else. The idea here is that we'll be able to start to navigate our app around our application and not have links just break all the time and return 404s. So for our application, we are going to end up with something very close to what I put in this diagram over here, if not exactly the same. So let's look at our table of all of our different routes. All right, so we are going to need our root page.tsx file. We're going to need a topics slug folder with a page.tsx file, topics slug post new, and topics slug post ID, and then a page.tsx in there. So in total for right now, a couple of different folders and 4 total page.tsx files, including the home page, which we had already created. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of folder creation. Let's get to it. Inside my app directory, I will make topics. Inside there is going to be my slug folder. So that's going to capture the slug of some topic. Inside of that, I'll make my first page.tsx. This is going to be my topic show page. Inside of that page.tsx file, I will immediately export default, a topic show page, and then return a div that says topic show. Okay, first one done. Next up, let's take care of posts. So inside this slug directory, I'll make posts. Inside of that, a folder called new. Inside of that, a page.tsx file. Inside of this page.tsx file, let's make a component called post create page. And I'll return a div that says something to that effect. And then finally, for right now, inside the post directory, I'll make another new folder. This will be a wildcard for post ID. And inside there, a new file of page.tsx. And this will be our post show page. All right, as usual, please double check your folder and file structure here, because if you have anything different, you're going to start to get 404 errors as you navigate around the application. Okay, that wasn't so bad because we didn't have that many pages this time around, but you can imagine that on a larger app, yeah, you're going to be making a lot of folders and a lot of files. Okay, halfway through, and the remaining steps are a lot easier than the ones we've already gone through. On to steps 4 and 5, and these two really go together. So we're going to identify all the places in our application where data changes in some way. So I'm really talking about where a user can click or type or something like that, submit a form, and cause some data to change. Then for each of these different locations, we're going to make a server action. So we're kind of getting ready for this idea of changing information inside of our app. Let's take a look at our mockups and go through step 4, identify all these locations. Okay, so first off, over here, looking at this page, no real way to change data outside of that sign up and sign in button. And we've already created server actions for those. When a user clicks on new topic right here, that doesn't actually create a new topic. Instead, it just shows this form. Now this form, however, this is clearly a location where we need to change some data. We need to create a topic whenever a user enters in a name and some description. So I'm going to identify this as the first place where I need to change some data. And in particular, I need to create a topic. Next up on this page over here, when I'm viewing a topic, nothing on here I can really edit or change. Okay, down here, create a post. Once again, obviously I got a big form. Yep, I need a server action for this thing. So a server action called something like create post. And then finally over here, when I'm viewing a post, I can add in comments using this form right here, or by clicking on the reply button and then editing the form that pops up. Remember, we're going to eventually do something like that, pop up a little form. So once again, this is clearly a location where I can change some data. And in particular, I'm trying to create a comment. So that's it for our application. We have 3 different server actions we immediately, very clearly, very obviously need. We need a server action to create a topic, to create a post, and to create a comment. So I'm going to create server action functions for each of these at a time, just so I have in my head, okay, I need to implement these things. Now, in the past, we wrote out all of our server actions inside the index.ts file. This time around, for this application, we're going to put together some super robust forms that have really, really good error handling, like way beyond what we did previously. And each of these server actions are going to end up growing in size quite a bit. So putting all these into this index.ts file, well, really messy really quickly. So instead, I'm going to create a separate file for each of these 3 different server actions that I know I will need. So I'm going to make 3 files inside of actions. The first one I will call create comment.ts, then create post.ts, and finally create topic.ts. And that should not be plural, should be just create topic. Then I'll go through each of these different files, and I'm just going to put in that use server directive at the top and create the actual function, because we're going to need some functions to exist for the last step that we'll go over in just a moment. I'll first begin with create topic. At the top, I'll put in use server. I'll then export async function, create topic. I'm going to save this. That's all I need for right now. I'm going to copy that and go over to create post. I'm going to paste in and update the function name to create post. And then finally over to create comment, paste in and update the name as well. Finally, it would be really nice throughout our entire project to be able to just import all of our different actions from the index.ts file, as opposed to having to import each of these individual files. So inside of my actions index.ts file, at the bottom down here, I'm going to simultaneously import and export those 3 different server action functions we just created. And this is super easy to do. All we have to do is write out export create comment from / create comment. And then repeat that process for the other 2 files as well. So create post and create topic. Finally, just to be complete, I would like to keep this pattern of having a separate file for every one of our server actions. So I want to move sign in and sign out to their own separate files. And I know these are really, really small functions, but over time, if we start to add in things like logging, whatnot, well, they might eventually start to grow. So I want to make separate files for sign in and sign out inside the actions directory. Let's take care of that really quick. So inside of actions, I'll make a file called signin.ts and another called signout.ts. Then back inside the index.ts file, I'm going to take everything here at the top and cut it. I'll then go into the sign in file and paste and delete the sign out function. Then I'll go to the sign out file, paste, and delete the sign in. And then finally, we need to add in some very similar exports into the index.ts file. So back inside of index.ts, at the top, I'm going to also export sign in from / sign in and sign out from / sign out. Very good. On to step 6, and this step is really the entire point of this whole design process. Remember that towards the end of the last project we were working on, when we went to build it for production, we saw that one of the caching mechanisms in Next.js was kicking in, and we ended up seeing some stale data in the browser even when we knew we were changing resources. So let me just give you a quick reminder on that caching mechanism. Okay, so there are many different forms of caching in Next.js, but the one we are talking about right now in particular is the full route cache. So when you go to build your application, Next is going to decide if your route is static or dynamic. And if it is static, it's going to render your page at build time and then store the result and serve that stored result off to everyone who accesses your application or that particular path. So that is a recipe for accidentally serving up stale data to your users. So you very often are going to use two different forms of cache revalidation. The first one we took a look at was time-based. And with the time-based revalidation, we pretty much said every so many seconds, just go ahead and re-render this page for the next person who tries to access it. The other form we looked at was on demand. So this is where we knew that some data was changing, and we were just about to show a user some page where they would expect to see that updated data. So for on demand, we could call the revalidate path function and then pass in the path that we want to forcibly attempt to re-render the next time someone tried to access that route. So with that in mind, on step 6, we're going to go around to each of our different server actions. We're going to think about what we are doing in those server actions and what data we are changing. And then based upon that, we're going to decide upon what paths we are probably going to need to revalidate. And we'll add in some comments to those server actions right now, just as a reminder to ourselves that when we go and implement those server actions, well, we need to call revalidate path. All right, so let's go through it. For each of our server actions, we're going to think about the data they are modifying, and then based upon that, what different pages or what different routes we are going to need to revalidate. First, we'll start off with create topic. So when we create a topic, we are creating a new record that is going to be listed out on the homepage. Remember, the homepage is going to list out all the different topics that exist inside of our app. So whenever a user creates a topic, we might decide to revalidate the homepage. Do we need to revalidate topic show? The answer is no, because we have not cached a topic that has not yet been created. When we call create topic, we are making a topic for the very, very first time. So there's not going to be any cached version of that page for us to revalidate. Next up, create post. Posts are displayed on the topic show page, and technically the home page as well. So whenever a user creates a post, we probably want to refresh the topic show page where all the different posts for that topic are listed out. So I'm going to say I probably want to revalidate topic show. Now, should we also revalidate the homepage? Because, well, posts are being displayed on the homepage as well. Well, remember something we spoke about with time-based cache control. Time-based cache control is very, very useful whenever we are showing something like a homepage for a social media site, where data behind the scenes might be changing all the time, but users don't really have the expectation of seeing the exact up to the second most recent data that is available. So this is a scenario where whenever a user creates a post, it is going to modify data being displayed on the homepage, but we probably don't need to instantly update the homepage. So instead, we might use a time-based mechanism on the homepage in addition to this forced revalidation whenever a user creates a topic. Then for create post, we also do not need to revalidate the create a post page because once again, there is no cached version of a page for a post that we just created. And then finally, create comment. Create comment. Well, whenever we make a comment, I just want to point out here, comments really are displayed all over the place, believe it or not. So even on the homepage, we display the number of comments that a post has. So when you create a comment in our application, this is a little piece of data, that's some piece of content that really does need to be updated. But once again, my question to you is, if I create a comment on a post that is being displayed on the homepage, can a user really realistically expect to see that number increment that instant, that very second? And if it didn't, would they even notice? I don't really think so. So I think that this is another solution or another situation where even though comments are being used on a couple of different pages, there's probably only one page where we want to forcibly, in that instant, revalidate. And that is the view a post page. Whenever a user makes a post, they're going to expect to see it appear on the screen instantly because they want to see their post. They want to read it and say, oh yeah, here's my data. It's the thing that I just made. So whenever a user creates a comment, I think we probably only want to revalidate the show a post page. Okay, so that's it. We've got our kind of revalidation set up here. And we probably also need to keep in mind some of these ideas around time-based revalidation as well, particularly for our homepage, because again, our homepage, it's going to be changing, or it's going to be showing data that's changing behind the scenes rather often, but we don't really need to re-render it every instantaneous or every microsecond or every request. Instead, maybe every 10 seconds or something like that. So now last step, we're going to go around to each of our different server actions and just put in some comments to remind ourselves for each of these when we're going to want to call revalidate path. Let's first begin with create topic. So inside of create topic, I'm going to put in a to-do here, and I'll say revalidate the homepage after creating a topic. And of course, I don't have to be that verbose. I could just say revalidate the homepage. That's totally fine as well. Next up, whenever I create a post, I want to revalidate the topic show page. So in create post.ts, a to-do, revalidate the topic show page. And then finally down here, whenever I create a comment, I need to revalidate the post show page. So inside of create comment, a to-do, revalidate post show page. And that's it. Now, once again, I cannot repeat it enough. Even though doing this work up front is a little bit tedious, and we've now been working on this project for a while, but have really not written that much code, trust me, the process we just went through is going to save us so much time and so much debugging down the road, because we're not going to build our app for production and then suddenly realize that data is just not updating on the page as we expect. So just doing this work up front, it really is going to save you an incredible amount of time. Let's work on showing those sign in and sign out buttons on the right-hand side. And then again, if user is signed in, we're going to show a profile image of the user instead. So we'll find our header component. We'll then scroll down a little bit. And right now we've got that ternary expression to decide whether or not the user is signed in or signed out. We're going to have to add in a ton of JSX right here to show those two buttons and assign some form actions to them so that the user can actually click on them and sign in or sign out. And we also going to have a ton of JSX to show that little user image as well. So putting all that inside this little ternary expression right here, probably not a good idea. So rather than doing this, let's create a new variable at the top of the file. Up here, I'm going to call it auth content and mark it as type react.react node. I'll then set up an if statement, and I'll say if session.user, if that is assigned, then we will update that auth content variable right here to show the little user image thing. Otherwise, the user must not be authenticated. So in that case, we'll set auth content to be something that says sign in, sign out. So those two buttons. And now we can make use of auth content down here in place of the ternary expression. So I'm going to delete that, put in auth content instead. And again, let's save this, test, and there we go. So now I've got either user image or sign in / sign out. And now, like I said, I've got a lot more space to put in all the JSX that we're going to need here. So let's first take care of showing the user image. So this is going to be a little profile image of the user. To do so, I'm going to replace that div with a avatar component. So avatar, that is a little kind of round circular image. All we have to do is assign it an src property. And inside of here, put a link to the image we want to display. The image we want to display, we can actually reference the JSON we're still printing up on the screen right now. So notice how our user object, this is the user object right here. Remember, it has that image property, and that's a link to my GitHub profile image. So we want to display for the src session.user.image. And then you'll notice that we are getting a type error here. It's just because there's a possibility that the user is not going to have an image at all. So we will default that to be an empty string, just to make that error go away. Okay, now let's test this out. Back over, I can see, yep, there's my little profile image right there. Looks good. Next, let's show our buttons to allow the user to sign in or sign out. So for this one, rather than the div that we currently have, we will put in 2 separate navbar items. And actually, you know what, let's put in a fragment first. Now we can put in our navbar items. That's better. So there's 1, and then 2. Then in the first one, we're going to display the button that says sign in, and the second one will show the button that says sign out. So for the first one, we'll put in a button that says sign in. We're going to give it a type of submit, a color of secondary, and a variant of bordered. Let me just save that so you can see everything. There we go. Then inside of the second navbar item, we'll display another button. This one will say sign up with a type of submit, a color of primary, and a variant of flat. And I think I might have put it in too many navbar items here. So if I scroll down, yeah, I put in a extra navbar item right here that we actually do not want. That was my mistake. So around auth content, I'm going to remove that navbar item like so. Okay, let's now test this out. So if we go back over, currently signed in, I see my avatar image, but if I sign out, I'll see those 2 buttons. You'll notice the styling on them is just a little bit different, just to kind of visually separate them. Okay, so again, we're making some good progress here. Now we just need to make sure that whenever a user clicks on one of these buttons, we attempt to actually sign the user in. Whenever a user clicks on one of these buttons, we want to sign our user in. Remember, we have very helpfully, ahead of time, already created some actions inside of our actions directory to sign the user in. So inside of source actions signin.ts, here is our server action. Whenever a user clicks on one of those buttons, we want to run or submit a form that's going to call this server action, and that's going to kick off the entire sign in process. So to set that all up at the top of our header component, we need to import our server actions. So we'll do a import star as actions from @/actions. And then around each of these buttons, we will place a form with a action of actions.signin. So there's one around the sign in button, and then we'll do another one around the sign up button. Like so. Now let's save. As usual, quick test back inside the browser. So I'm currently not authenticated, but if I click on the sign in button, after a brief pause, we'll see, there we go, I'm signed in. And if I sign out, and I try the sign up button, we should see the exact same result. Well, that was definitely not too bad at all, right? Kind of straightforward, kind of easy. And again, it's all because we created these server actions ahead of time. So we've got these server actions that are super easy to use across our project. Anytime we want to change some data related to the user in response to them doing something, we can pretty much just put down a form, toss an action into it, and that's it. That's all we really have to do. So now the last thing we have to add in, as I mentioned, just to the right-hand side of the, or I should say the left-hand side of the user image, I want to display a little menu that will pop up, and inside there, a very simple sign out button. So let's take care of that really quickly as well. To do so, back up to the top of the file, we're going to add in a couple more imports from Next.UI/React. We are going to get pop over trigger, and pop over content. So these are some components that allow us to very easily show a little window that's just going to kind of suddenly pop up whenever a user clicks on something. To make use of them, we'll find our auth content that is currently showing avatar right here. And I'm going to give myself a little bit of space. I'm going to wrap avatar with a pop over, like so. And make sure you delete the semicolon, which you might still have at the end of the avatar line. On pop over, I'm going to give that a placement of left. And that's kind of determining on what side of the thing that we're going to click is going to open the window up. So in this case, I want to open up this little window on the left-hand side of this avatar component that the user is going to click on. Then around avatar, we're going to wrap that with a pop over trigger, like so. And let me fix some indentation here to make it easier to read. So the pop over trigger defines exactly what a user is going to click on to show the window. And then the actual window itself that is going to be shown and hidden is going to be the pop over content. Inside of pop over content, as I mentioned, all we want to do is display a button the user can click on to sign out. We're going to add in a div with a class name of p-4. And then inside there, to sign a user out, remember we've got another one of those server actions already created. So to run that server action, we will place a form that has an action of actions.signout. And inside there, we can show a button that says sign out, and the button itself should have a type of submit. Okay, so that should be it. Back over to the browser for another test. I'm going to refresh this time just to make sure everything is up to date. And now I should be able to click on my image right there, and I'll see the sign out button. And if I click on it, hey, there we go, nicely signed out. And now if I want to, I can easily sign back in. Okay, well, we are making great progress on the header. Now, even though we are making progress and we're getting content to show up, there's now some kind of slightly unexpected things that are happening behind the scenes in our application. And I want you to recall something I've told you a couple times now, as we've discussed caching. As we have worked with caching and whatnot, these are a couple of different systems and they tie together in different ways. And one of the kind of most surprising system is the full route cache. And in this full route cache, whenever this caching mechanism kicks into play, Next is going to decide if your route is static or dynamic. So right now, the way we have put together that header component, if we try to build our application, we would end up seeing some slightly surprising behavior. So let's take a pause right here. We're going to come back in a moment. We're going to clean up our page component, which is currently showing all that user data. So I don't want to show this in here anymore in the page component. We're then going to try to build our application and very quickly see some surprising results during that build process. As I hinted at just a moment ago, we're going to revisit the idea of caching in our application. So we're going to revisit that idea of the full route cache. And again, just as a reminder, at build time, Next is going to decide if your page is static or dynamic. If it is static, it's going to render that page at build time and store the results. In general, as much as possible, we kind of like to have these more static pages because they are way more performant. They load up on a user's browser extremely quickly. So in general, we kind of like static. And that means that as we are initially building our application, it kind of makes sense every now and then to run that npm run build command, and then take a look at the output. Remember, this is the output we get, and we look at those different symbols, because those symbols tell us whether our page is going to be static or dynamic. So with that in mind, right now, I want to clear out all the content on our homepage. I then want to run npm run build, and just make sure that at present we have a statically built page. Because right now, I think that we're not really doing any data fetching or doing anything wild. We should probably end up with static page, right? Well, let's just test this out and see what happens. So back inside of my editor, I'm going to find the app page.tsx file. I don't need any of the stuff related to authentication in here anymore. We just put that in as quick little testing to understand how authentication works. So I'm going to delete everything inside this component and replace it with a simple div that says homepage. I'm also going to delete the stuff at the top, and I'm also going to delete that async keyword because we just don't need it anymore. So now we've got an extremely simple page. So in theory, if everything is kind of working as expected, if we build this application right now, I would expect to see the output say that we have a totally static homepage. And the way I'm talking here, you could probably guess, yeah, that's not at all what's going to happen. So let's open up our terminal and build our application and just see what happens. I can stop my running server and then do a npm run build. And again, our kind of hope right now is to see that the homepage is statically rendered. So let's wait. And sure enough, we get some kind of surprising results. We've got a couple of different routes right now. We've got our homepage, we've got the API endpoints for handling authentication, and then we've got our different routes that handle showing, creating a post, and whatnot. And surprisingly, all of them have been marked as dynamic. So the ones down here, the ones where we show a topic or create a post or show a post, having those be dynamic is not that surprising because we're making use of those wildcard characters inside of the route. And as you might recall, there are a couple of rules that are used to determine whether or not a page is static or dynamic. And one of those rules is whether or not we are using a dynamic route. So if we have those little square brackets, that means that Next is going to assume that, yeah, we've got a dynamic page. So seeing that these are dynamic down here, that totally makes sense. As a reminder, we can make these be static by implementing those get static or generate static params functions that we looked at previously. But those routes aside, why is our homepage currently a dynamic route? It's not doing anything related to these route parameters. It's not fetching any data. Doesn't seem to be doing anything like that. Well, obviously something weird is going on. So you might recall that when I showed you this diagram previously, I told you you don't need to memorize these up front. Instead, go and build your application, see if a route is coming up as dynamic, and then if it is and you want it to be static, then start to go over this list and kind of narrow down the possibilities of why your route is dynamic. So let's go from the bottom up to figure out why the home page is dynamic. Are we using a dynamic route on the home page? Nope, definitely not. Are we calling fetch and opting out of caching of the response? Nope, definitely not. We're not calling fetch at all right now. Have we assigned any route segment configuration options? No, definitely have not done that inside of our homepage. And then finally, and as you guessed, this one is the key part, are we calling a dynamic function or referencing a dynamic variable when our route renders? And we might look at these and say, no, not happening, but the answer is actually yes, we absolutely positively are. And even though the last 4 minutes of this video have probably been a little bit mysterious, here's where we get to the big point of the video, and this is a really important part that I really want you to understand. Right now, on every page of our entire application, we are showing our header component because we added it to the layout file. Here it is right here. Inside of that component, let's open up the header. We are calling that auth function right there. And we're doing that so we can figure out whether or not a user is signed in. Whenever you make use of this auth function, behind the scenes, NextAuth is going to access and possibly modify the cookies inside of the request. We are modifying cookies, or possibly just reading them. And because we are doing that inside the header, that means that every single component that includes the header, or I should say every route that includes the header, which is every page in our application right now, is going to be marked as dynamic. So just the sheer fact that we're checking to see if a user is logged in or not, that's going to make our page dynamic. So the immediate big issue here that we need to consider: should we completely drop this idea of static rendering just because we're using authentication? No, we probably don't. We are using authentication, but, well, I don't want to completely opt out of any form of static caching because, again, in general, we like caching. It makes our application really fast. So we need to figure out some way of making use of authentication, but still opting into or making use of this static rendering as well. So let's start to investigate that in just a moment. To quickly reiterate what we just went over in the last video, we've got a layout, any page in our application, and then a header is always being displayed. And that header component has some code inside of it that is going to mess around or otherwise handle cookies in some way. And in general, anytime we touch cookies, we assume that this entire route is dynamic. And we don't really want that. We don't want that to be the default behavior. We would prefer to be able to render this page statically. So here's how we are going to still make use of authentication in the header, but allow ourselves to render this page statically at build time. Okay, so it's really simple. We're going to move the authentication stuff into a client component. So we're going to have our layout at the top. It's going to still display a header, But then the header itself is not going to access authentication or otherwise mess with cookies in any way. Instead, we're going to create this new header auth component. It's going to be a client component, and it's going to handle all the stuff on the right-hand side of that header. So basically deciding whether to show the authentication buttons or that kind of user avatar little menu thing. Because this header auth component is figuring out the current authentication status through the use of the use session hook, which is what we use when we try to figure out authentication in a client component, use session does not directly access cookies. Instead, it makes a request to the backend server to a route that is automatically created for us by Next.js or NextAuth. And it's going to use that route to figure out the authentication status. So again, no cookies accessed. That means we have the ability at least to be static. Now, it's not guaranteed, of course, that we're going to be static. We could be doing something else on this page or in the header that will make our route dynamic, but at least this alone is not going to cause us to be dynamic. So that's it. Let's make a header component or header auth component. It's going to be a client component, and it's going to figure out the authentication status through the use of the use session hook. So back over here, in my components directory, I'll make a new file called header auth.tsx. Then at the top, we'll immediately mark this with use client. And then let's just copy over all these different imports from the current header file. So inside of header.tsx, I'm going to just copy all this stuff over, save us a lot of typing around those imports. Then I will export default my header auth component. And inside of here, we want to figure out what the current authentication status is. And again, that means we're going to need to use the use session hook. So I'm going to update the import right here. Instead of import auth from @auth, we'll update that to be import use session from NextAuth/React. Then inside of here, we can get the current session object. And then after that, we can write in our different conditions. So if user is signed in, show that avatar image, otherwise show the sign in and sign up buttons. So for that, let's just do a copy paste from the header.tsx file. Back over here, I'll go down. I'm going to find that auth content section right here. We're going to find that entire if-else statement and cut it. Go back over to header auth and paste it in. So I've got that huge if-else right here. And the first thing we have to do is fix up how we access the session. Remember, when we make use of use session, the session object we get back is slightly different in nature. To get access to the user object now, in this case, we have to change this to be session.data ? And then when we try to access the user's image, that's now going to be session.data.user. Okay. Now at the very bottom of our component, we can return auth content. So that's going to be either the set of buttons or the user avatar thing. And now I think that the last thing we really have to do here is save this file and then go back over to our header and make use of this new component. So back inside of header.tsx, at the very top, I'm going to delete all these imports that we are no longer using. I do not want to access my current authentication status in here anymore, so I'm going to remove that line. And that means that my component no longer has to be async, so I can delete that. Then we can clean up these two imports right here. And then finally, we'll import header auth from @/components header-auth. And then we will display that down here inside of the navbar content. And that should be it. Okay, so now let's start up our server and just do a quick test, make sure everything is working. As long as it is, then we'll go and build our application and make sure that we now have a static route, hopefully, for our homepage. So we'll do that npm run dev. And then in our browser, let's refresh the page. And it's going to take just a moment, but I'll see that I'm currently not signed in. So I'm going to attempt to sign in by clicking on sign in. And then I will see it go over to my avatar image. So definitely looks like it's working, but there's one other very small gotcha here now. Because we are now fetching our authentication status in the browser, because useSession makes a request to the backend server, there's a period of time when our page first loads up in the browser where we don't yet know if the user is authenticated. And because of the way we have put together our header auth component right now, during that time where we are not sure if we are authenticated or not, because we're still waiting on this request, our component is going to default to showing the sign in and sign up buttons. So watch this. Right now, I'm definitely authenticated. But if I refresh, there's going to be that very small period of time where I show those buttons until we complete the request and determine, yeah, we are signed in. So to fix that up, let's go back over to our header auth file again. And I'm going to add in another case to this if-else statement. I'm going to say like this. So I'm going to add in a if at the start and then put in the else if right here. And now in this if statement, to figure out whether or not we are still kind of trying to figure out whether or not we are loading in or trying to fetch the current authentication status, we can take a look at session.status. So session.status is going to be a string that tells us whether we are definitely authenticated, not authenticated, or still loading up the authentication state. When we are still in the process of fetching the authentication state from the backend, session.status is going to be equal to a string of loading. So if that is the case, then we're going to set auth content to just be null. So don't print up anything at all. So while we are now loading up authentication, don't do anything. Once we have loaded up something, go ahead and figure out whether or not the user is signed in which case display the avatar thing. Otherwise, if we are not loading and we are not signed in, show the sign in and sign up buttons. Okay, one last test here. Let's refresh. Now we're going to see nothing, and then our image appear. Perfect. Okay, so that definitely all works. So now here's the moment of truth. Let's try to build our application and see whether or not we are now working with a static or a dynamic route. So we'll open up our terminal, stop the server, and do a npm run build. And then after a little pause, eventually we're going to see, there we go. So now we are back to a static route because we are figuring out all this authentication stuff in the browser. And so we're not worrying about trying to access cookies or anything like that when we are rendering our component on the server. Very good. I've started my server back up, and inside the browser, you'll notice that right now, of course, we have not done anything around this search bar just yet, but we don't actually have any post to search over. So we're going to step away from the header for a moment and work on something else. We're going to make sure we can create topics and then eventually create posts inside them as well. Once we implement all that, then we can come back and start to implement the search bar at the top. Okay, so here's the next thing that we are going to work on. We're going to add in the ability to create a new topic. So on the right-hand side of the screen, underneath the header, I want to show a button that says New Topic. Whenever we click on that, we're going to have a little window pop up, very similar to the one that we have for the sign out functionality right now. Inside there, we'll show a form to create a new topic. Every topic must have a name and a description. So we're going to enter those in, click Submit, and then we should probably redirect the user over to that newly created topic page or something like that. Now, in the past, we haven't worried too much around validation or anything like that. So we're going to change that on this application. Every form we create is going to have some rather rigorous validation tied to it. So if a user tries to say, enter in a name for a topic that is too short, I want to specifically highlight that field in red and say, sorry, but the name needs to be longer. Same thing for the description. If user enters a description that's not long enough, highlight that, show an error to the user. So we're going to make them fix these errors before we actually create any record. Now I'm going to tell you right now that implementing fully featured validation like this is just a little bit tricky because there's going to be several things that we have to do now inside of our server actions. That's where the validation is going to be implemented. We're going to implement it in the server action. So our server actions are going to become just a little bit busy. There's going to be a lot of code in them, but it won't be the worst thing in the world. I just mean to say there's going to be a lot of code in the server actions. That's all. And the other upside to this is that once we understand the validation process just one time, we can then honestly start to really copy paste some code around our project pretty easily. That's going to implement validation pretty straightforward fashion for all of our different forms. Okay, so enough talking. Well, maybe just a little bit more. One last thing I want to mention here. Here's how we're going to implement this homepage. So we've got our layout at the top that shows a header. It's going to show our homepage. And then on the homepage, I want to show a list of posts on the left-hand side. So that's going to be kind of this area right here. And that component is going to be called our post list. And then on the right-hand side, all that stuff over there, we're going to call that one our topic create form. So for right now, we're going to be focused on topic create form. Let's make a new component with that name, and we're going to display it inside of our homepage. Okay, so back over inside of our editor. In the components directory, we're going to have one or two components, honestly, probably two, maybe three, tied to topics. So rather than continuing to just throw all of our component files directly into the components folder, let's start to add in a little bit of organization. Inside the components directory, I'll make a new folder called topics. And then inside there, I'll make a topic-create-form.tsx. Then inside this file, we're going to export default function topic create form. And as usual for right now, just a div that says topic create form. Let's then go back over to our homepage file, and we're going to scaffold together just a little bit of styling to get the basic layout of our homepage, and then we'll display this topic create form inside of it. So inside of our app page.tsx file, here's our homepage. At the top, let's import that topic create form from @components topics topic create form. And then again, we're going to add in just a little bit of structure here beyond what we already have. So we're going to return a div that has a class name of grid cols-4, gap-4, and p-4. Inside there, we will add another div, this one with a class name of col span-3. And inside of that, we will place an h1 that says top posts, and we'll give that a class name of text-xl and im-2. So as you guess, this is kind of the left-hand side of the page, where we're going to eventually list out all of our different posts. Then after that div, we'll place another div, and inside this one, the topic create form component. Okay, let's save this and see how we're doing. So now on the left-hand side, we've got top posts. Over here, topic create form, and that's a reasonable place to get started. So let's start to work on this form in the next video. Next up, inside of our topic create form component, we're going to display a button. Whenever a user clicks on that button, we want to open up this little menu right here. So we're going to use that same pop over component technique that we used to back up in the user avatar button inside of our header. So let's show that pop over, and then inside there, we'll start to build out the basic form, which is basically just going to be a plain form, input, and we're going to use a text area for the description, and then a button at the bottom that the user can click. All right, so inside of topic create form, we'll begin by importing a couple of components from the NextUI library at the top. We'll import input, button, text area, and notice that text area has a lowercase a here, and then pop over trigger, and pop over content. And that's all going to come from at nextui-org/react. Then inside of topic create form, I'm going to remove the div, and instead, we'll return a popover, and the placement again is going to be on the left-hand side. A popover trigger. Inside there, we can place a button that says create a topic. And let's give that a color of primary, which will just make it a really nice bright blue, kind of draw the user's eye to it. Then after the popover trigger, we'll put in our pop over content. And inside there, that's going to be basically the little window that is going to show up on the screen. So we will display a form here. Inside of that, we're going to add a div to add just a little bit of layout to this. We'll use a class name of flex, flex-col, gap-4, p-4, and w-80. Inside this div, at the very top, we'll display an h3 that says create a topic with a class name of text-lg. Then we'll show our input. We're going to give that a label of name, a label placement of outside. That's going to affect some of the styling, kind of where the label gets placed, and then a placeholder of name. Almost done here. I know this is a lot of typing. Next, we're going to show the text area and then the button. So the text area is going to be very similar. The text area will have a label of description, a label placement of outside, and then a placeholder of describe your topic. Let me save this just to get the formatting a little bit easier to read. So there's our text area. So the input and the text area right now have identical props, at least in terms of the name of the props. Last thing, underneath the text area, we'll place our button that a user can click on. So we'll give a text of submit and a type of submit. Okay, that should be it. So again, a lot of typing. Let's flip back over, see how we're doing. So now on the right-hand side, we've got create a topic. And when we click on it, we get this nice big form appearing where a user can enter in the name and the description for the topic they want to create. Now remember, we did a whole bunch of design up front, which was really handy because we know that at some point in time, a user is going to submit this form. And whenever they submit that form, we want to create some data. And remember what we do when we want to create data or change data inside of a Next application, we call a server action. And as a part of all that initial design, we already put all of our different server actions together. So we can already import our server action function. It doesn't really do anything right now, but we can at least wire it up to the form. Let's do that right away. Whenever a user submits the form, we want to call this create topic action. So at the very top, let's import our actions. From @/actions. And then on the form, we'll assign our action of actions.createTopic. Okay, so this is looking good. We're off to a great start here in terms of styling at least, but we still have to add in, well, basically everything around the functionality. So the ability to actually create a topic, do some validation, and then redirect the user after the topic has been created. We just put together our form. So we've got something being displayed right here, but if we type something in and click on submit, well, basically nothing happens at present. So I want to really focus on the entire process of how the browser pulls values out of this form, us receiving it inside the server action, and then as I mentioned, we're going to do some heavy duty validation of this data this time around and make sure that some validation errors will be displayed inside this form back to the user so that they can fix up any issues with, say, entering maybe a name that's too short or a name with symbols inside of it that is not allowed, and so on. So to get started, inside of topic create form, I'm going to find our input and our text area. We did not add in name props to these in the last video, so let's add those in now. On the input, I'll provide a name of name, and on the text area, a name of description. Remember what these name props do. They modify how we access the form data inside the form data object inside of our server action. Let's get an example of that right away. So whenever a user submits this form, we are going to call create topic. Let's open up that server action. So source actions, create topic, here it is right here. We will receive that form data variable of type form data. And then because we put in a name property of name, we can access that text inputs value on this form data object using specifically get name, like so. And then for description, we used a name prop of description. So similarly, we'll put in get description right here. For right now, let's just add in a console log of name and description and make sure we've wired up everything correctly. I'm going to save this back over to my browser. I'll enter in a name of JavaScript, maybe a description of a topic to discuss JavaScript. I'll submit that. And now if I open up my server terminal window, I should see those console logs right there of JavaScript and a topic to discuss JavaScript. Okay, so we've received this data inside of our server action, and we've been over this stuff before, but now I want to add in something new. I want to add in some actual validation of this information. I want to make sure that a user entered in some appropriate name and some appropriate description. And if they didn't, I need to return some information back and make sure we render it in our form so that the user sees something appear on the screen that says, hey, you need to enter a valid name and some valid description. So to do this validation, we're going to first talk about a library that we're going to install into our project that's going to automate this entire validation process. Let's take a look at this new library in just a moment. To add in some validation to this name and description, we're going to use a third-party package that we're going to install into our project called Zod. So Z-O-D, Zod. To make use of Zod, we're going to import some variable called Z from the library. So you're going to see this variable called Z quite a bit. Again, it's a reference to the Zod library. To make use of Zod, we're going to first create something called a schema object. This is essentially a set of validation rules that we want to apply to some data in our application. We can use a schema object to validate things like arrays, objects, strings, numbers, booleans, just about every piece of data you can imagine inside of a JavaScript program. So here's an example of a schema we're going to put together. And we want to think of this schema as being like a set of rules on what we want our data to look like. So in this case, I'm saying that I want to have an object that has a name property that is going to be a string that must be at least 3 characters long and must match this pattern. In this particular case, the regular expression saying that the name must be lowercase letters and it can have a dash character. But if it has anything else, like say numbers, capital letters, or any other symbol, then it's going to fail validation. In addition, we're going to have a description property that must be a string and must be at least 10 characters long. When we create this schema object, we then get back this validator thing. We get an object that we can use to validate some information provided by a user or really any other part of our program. Let's install Zod right away and then create our schema. So back inside my editor, I'm going to open my terminal and stop the development server. I'll install Zod with a npm install Zod. I'll then start my server back up. Okay. Then inside of our server action file, I'm going to import that Z from Zod. And then we're going to create the same kind of schema that you just saw in that diagram. I'm going to call it create topic schema. This will be z.object. And we're going to say that we want a name property that is going to be a string that must be at least 3 characters long. And it must match the regular expression of square brackets. And inside those square brackets, we're going to put a dash z dash. Again, this regular expression makes sure that the user enters a name that is only lowercase characters, or it can have a dash as well. On this regular expression right here, I'm going to also add in one additional property. So as a second argument, I'm going to put in an object that has a message of must be lowercase letters or dashes without spaces. You'll see where this message gets used in just a moment. Okay, then inside of our schema, I'm going to also add in a description. So I'm going to say that we must have a description property that will be a string, and it must be at least 10 characters long. Okay, so now that we have created the schema object, we can use it to validate some data inside of our application. So let me show you how that part works. All right, so up here, once again, we've created our schema. We've got our schema right here in the middle. The schema has a function tied to it called saveParse. When we call saveParse, we can pass in some data. So here's an example of some valid data that we might pass in to the saveParse function. In this case, we know that it is valid data because it has a name and a description that are strings and they're of the appropriate length. So if we pass this information into the saveParse function, here's what we're going to get out. We'll get an object that looks like this. It'll have a success property of true, and then a data property that contains our information that we submitted in. So we can now take this data property and use it for whatever we want inside of our program. In our case, we're going to use it to create a new topic object inside of our database. But what happens if we submit some invalid data? Well, in this case, if we have some invalid data that looks like this right here, so a name that is maybe a $sign, which is not allowed, it's also too short, and a description that is too short, if we pass that into the saveParse function, then we're going to get back a slightly different object. We get back an object that has a success property of false, and then it has an error property as well that's going to have a lot of information about exactly what failed around validation. Now let's try making use of the schema object we just created to validate the information that is coming in off of our form. Here's how we would do it. Back over here, I'll go down to create topic. I'm going to clear out all the stuff we've done in there already and replace it with result is create topic schema. And then we'll pass in an object that has a name of form data.getName and a description of form data.getDescription. And did I make a typo here? Oh, my mistake. Create topic schema dot saveParse. I was not paying attention to my own diagram. So we're going to call specifically the saveParse function on it. So now we get back this result object. If you just tried to print out result.error, like so I showed you in a diagram just a moment ago that if we get some invalid data, there's going to be this error property. If you try to just print that out, you're going to get a TypeScript error. TypeScript wants you to first see if this parsing was successful or not. So we need to first take a look at result.success. And in particular, if it was not successful. So if parsing was not successful, then we are allowed to reference result.error, like so. So now let's save this and just see what happens if we try to submit some invalid data to our form now. Let's see what happens with this error property. Okay, so back over here, I'm going to refresh. It'll take just a moment because I restarted my server. Now I'll enter in some invalid name and an invalid description and click on submit. I'll then go over to my terminal. And here is our console log. So we're going to see that we get this big list of validation errors. And it tells us some stuff like, hey, the string is too short. We get that custom message that we added. So there's where that message property was used, that we added into that regular expression function right there. So it tells us must be lowercase letters or dashes without spaces. And then we also get this message of string must contain at least 10 characters. So this is the failed validation info. But right now it's in a format that's kind of hard for us to access. So it's just a big list of error objects. And we would have to kind of map over these or try to find different objects in there and then print them up at appropriate locations inside of our component. So in short, using the errors in this format is a little bit tedious. So let me show you a little trick. Rather than just making use of result.error, we're going to do a console log of result.error.flatten. We're going to call that function, and then we will reference field errors. Now I'm going to save that, clear my terminal, and then submit the form again. Then back over to my terminal once again, and now take a look at this. Much easier for us to reference and work with. So now we get a plain object that has a name property that will be an array of strings that describes all the issues with the data that we submitted. Same thing for description as well. If we pass validation on one of these fields, then that field is just not going to show up in this object. So for example, if I put in a valid description here and submit, Now I'm only going to have a name property. So I get just a name with an array of strings telling me what I need to do to fix this thing up. Okay, so that is Zod. Once again, the general flow that we're going to go through here is that we're going to create a schema. We're then going to call save parse. We get back a result. We're going to take a look at the result.success property. And if we want to get back a very well-formatted list of errors that we can easily show inside of our form, we can call result, error, flatten, and then reference field errors. Okay, so now we've got some idea of validation. Well, we got to take these list of errors and show them in our form. So we'll figure out how to do that in just a moment. Inside of create topic, we are now validating the information that the user submitted. And so we end up with this nicely formatted object that has all the errors tied to the form. So now we need to take these errors and somehow display them in the form to the user. So we're talking about kind of bailing early out of a server action and returning some information back over to the form so it can be rendered on the screen. Remember that to do this in the past, we made use of that hook called useFormState. So we're going to use that hook here again. Let me give you a quick reminder on how that hook works. All right, so inside of our component, we're going to call that useFormState hook, and we're going to define some initial state. This state is going to be automatically embedded into the form. A user is then going to enter in a name and a description and submit the form. That info will be encoded in a form data object that will be sent off to our server action. Along the way, the form state is going to be automatically included as well. Then inside of our server action, we're going to do some validation using this Zod library, and we will get back a list of errors that is going to look rather similar to the structure of our form state. So we then want to communicate that information back over to our component. Remember how we do so? We just return a value. Whatever we return from our server action is going to be sent back over to our component and show up in there as form state. Now, if we fail validation with the Zod library, we're going to have an object that looks like this right here, and it's going to have an array of strings for each failed validation property. So name might have a string inside of it of something like must be longer than 3 chars. And description might be something like must be longer. So we can very easily write out some JSX that will take a look at this form state object and then print out this list of errors underneath each individual field in our form. So we could very easily show a little red box right here and then write out some JSX that will be something like curly braces, form state, dot errors, dot name, dot join with maybe a comma. And the join is because, remember, this is going to be a list of strings. So that JSX would end up printing something like must be longer than 3 characters. And we could do something very similar for our description as well. So must be longer or whatever else. Okay, so that's the general plan. That's how we're going to work form state and the Zod library together. Let's get started on this implementation in just a moment. Let's go back over to our form and add in some form state. So inside of topic create form, at the top of the file, I will import use form state. Remember, that is from React DOM, not from React. This is a hook, and hooks can only be used in client components. So we need to turn this component into a client component by adding in use client at the top. Next up, down here, we can call use form state. Remember, we get back an array with 2 elements in it. The first is going to be our form state, and the second will be a wrapped up version of our server action. Then the first element, or first argument to use form state itself, will be the server action we want to call, which for us is actions.createTopic. And then the second argument is going to be some initial state object. And in the past, we put in something like a message object that had some string property. Now, something I want to do as a very quick aside here, and I apologize for putting this right here, like in the course, because at present, we're deep into this stuff around Zod and whatnot and all that kind of stuff. But it's really important for you to understand this, and this is a really, well, better than no other time, I guess is the best way to put it. As you start to use form state, you're going to start to write out code that looks like so, and you're going to notice really quickly that you always seem to get these errors coming from whatever action you put in as the first argument to use form state. So I want to very quickly explain to you exactly why you're going to see these errors really often and exactly how to fix it. because if you just try to read the error message, it's going to be extremely unclear. You can notice this is a giant error message, and the documentation itself is very lacking in this topic as well. So let me give you a summary of what's going on here. Okay, so back over here, I want you to recall what I've told you so many points in time at this point. We've got this form state object. It's going to flow in as the first argument to the server action. The server action is then going to return something that looks like that same kind of object, and that's going to flow back into our component, showing up as the form state variable that comes out of our hook. So specifically, that form state right there. Additionally, whatever we put in as a second argument is going to serve as the initial value for that form state. So for that same form state right there. So keeping that in mind, we're pretty much saying that the initial state inside the component, the first argument to the server action, and the return value from the server action all need to be the same type of object. And when I say type, I'm talking about like the TypeScript type. That's what the error is really talking about here. Let me show you one other diagram. It's going to really hopefully clarify things a little bit. So here's pretty much what it comes down to. Inside of your component, you are going to call useFormState, pass in your server action, and then some kind of additional argument that's going to be your initial state. And then inside of your server action itself, the first argument to it is going to be your form state, and the server action is going to return a value as well. These types, all three of these must match. They need to be the same type, or if nothing else, they need to be compatible with each other. So let me show you a very simple example of this right away. Rather than having some initial state of an object, I'm going to use a number instead. So I'm just going to put in the number 5, like so. So now the piece of state that I'm passing around between all these different locations, it must be type number. So that's going to be a number. And that means that the first argument to my server action is going to be a number. And that means that I must return a number from the server action as well. So if I go into my server action and I add in this form state argument and I make it type number and I return a number, we're going to see that TypeScript error right there go away. And that's why I say that this is a really cryptic error, because it's an error that's kind of coming up inside of topic create form, but we need to go into the server action to make it go away. That's why I think this is kind of a confusing topic. So let's open up the server action. We're going to find the function itself. Because we are using useFormState, now there's going to be a first argument that automatically gets added in, and we will call that formState. So we must say that this is a number right here. And then at the bottom of our function, we must return a number as well. And how about down here, I'll do 10 instead. So now if I save all these files and go back over to create topic create form, the error went away. I am getting an error down here because I need to use the action that's coming out of the hook. Let's take care of that really quick, like so. And now all errors are solved. So that's how you solve this type error. And I guarantee you're probably going to get this when you start working on your own projects. So the takeaway here, the thing you want to keep in mind, these types, they've got to match. That's pretty much it. So now we've got this little side topic down. Let's move forward with our validation stuff in a moment. We just learned how to make all these types around useFormState kind of work out. So obviously we cannot just have an initial state in here of a number because, well, we're trying to actually communicate some objects and whatnot between our server action and this hook. So we need to replace these numbers, that right there, and the number type right there, and the return 10 down there, with some actual kind of coordinated types in all these locations. And in this case, it's just a little bit challenging because of the structure of our form state object. Remember, we want to have an object that has an errors property. There's going to be an object that has a name and a description that will be arrays of strings. Complicating things, remember that if we pass validation on one of these fields, it will not be listed inside the errors object. So it just won't be there if description is okay. And conversely, if the name is okay but the description is not, it will look like that. So we need to write out a type that's going to be kind of encompass all these different cases, and then use that type right there for our number. And then we need to return some kind of compatible object from our server action. And we need to put in a compatible object back over here at useFormState. So let's go through this one time by hand, and then I'll show you a nice little easy workaround that we can use here. That's still going to put in some type safety with TypeScript. So first, right up here, right underneath our topic schema, I'm going to define a new interface called create topic form state. And we know that we want this thing to have an errors object that might have a name property. And if it does exist, it will be an empty array of strings. And there might also be a description property. So we'll put in a question mark. And if it does exist, it will likewise be an empty array, or not an empty array, but an array of strings. So now we can use this type right here to annotate the type of form state. So I'll put in create topic form state right there. Next, we need to make sure that our function itself returns a value with that type. To make sure we do that, we can put in a declared type return annotation on the function. So after the arguments, we could put in colon promise create topic form state. The promise is because this is an async function. So now down here, we're going to see that we're getting an error because we are not returning a value that is compatible with what we said we want to return. So to get this working, we can return an object that has an errors property that is going to be an empty object. And if something goes wrong with validation, so if we are unsuccessful on validation, rather than doing a console log, let's try to return also some kind of appropriate object. So to do so, we'll return an object with a errors property of result error flatten dot field errors. And I'm going to delete the console log. Okay, so now our server action is complete. We've put in an appropriate type for this first argument right here. We've declared exactly what type we want to return from the function. And then in either case, whether we are successful with validation or not, we are returning a value that is compatible with those types. So now we're going to go back over to our topic create form. And we're going to adjust the initial state argument right here. So we need to put in just essentially any kind of object right here that is compatible with what we said we were going to return from the server action. So in this case, we'll put in an object with a errors property that will be an empty object. And that's it. So now our types in all three locations line up. We've got a value right here that is compatible with what we are returning from our server action, and that is compatible with what we said that we are going to be receiving as the first argument to our server action. Now, I know this is a nasty thing because we have to coordinate all these types all over the place. So I really encourage you, when you're working on your own project, just remember this diagram right here. And remember the types we put in these different locations, they got to match. That's pretty much it. Now, the actual values you put in there and different properties they have really comes down to what you are trying to build. For us, we decided to put in an initial form state right here of an empty errors object, because that means the first time that we render topic create form, we're going to initially have 0 errors. There's no errors because we're showing the form for the very first time. So that's why I decided to put in an initial state like this. All right, on to our last step here for getting in some validation. Now that we've got some form state and it contains all the different errors that occurred during validation, we can reference those inside of our form and print them out to the user. Now, normally, if we were not using the Next UI library, we could do so by doing something like form state.errors.name, and that will be an array of strings that tells us everything that's wrong with the input that the user provided. So we could join all those errors together, and then we could wrap that in a div that has some styling applied to it to make this thing red. So maybe a red background like so. So that's what we would do if we're not making use of Next UI. But in our case, we are making use of Next UI, which builds in error handling, or I should say displaying errors on an input and a text area as props to these components. So we're going to add in some error information to the user by adding in a prop to the input of is invalid. And that's going to be not to turn this into a Boolean, form state.errors.name. And then our error message is going to be form state.errors.name, and that might be undefined. So we're going to put in a question mark, .join with a comma and a space. And we'll do something similar down on our text area as well. So down here, we will enter in is invalid, not form state, errors description. And again, that's to turn that thing into a Boolean. And then our error message is going to likewise be form state dot errors dot description. That might be undefined, so we need to put in the question mark dot join comma space. All right, let's save this and do a test and see how we're doing. So now back over here, if I go to create topic and I enter in some invalid name and invalid description and click on submit, hey, there we go. There's our validation in line with each field, and it tells us exactly what's going on and how to fix the problem. So that's it. Now, yeah, doing this validation stuff for some round, kind of confusing, but here's the good news. Once you do this one time inside your project, that's kind of it, because we can really take what we've done inside of our server action, and we're going to repeat the exact same process inside of all of our other server actions. So you really just have to understand this one time, and then from there, just going to do the same thing over and over to implement any kind of validation. We've got some field-based validation going on, which is fantastic, and it really was not that hard to put together. But we're not quite done yet. See, there's one other little piece of validation we need to add into a form. There are other kinds of errors that might occur around this that are not tied to specific fields. For example, if a user tries to create a topic while they are not logged in, we probably want to show an error message down here, right above the button, that says, please log in to create a topic. And if a user does try to create a valid topic while they are signed in, but we just fail to save a topic to the database for any reason, well, likewise, we probably want to show an error message down here. So we need to add in the ability to support kind of generic overall issues inside of our form, beyond just this field-based validation we are doing right now. So here's how we're going to add that in. I'm going to go first up to my create topic form state, and I'm going to add in a new property to this errors object. I'm going to call it underscore form. So that's going to be an array of strings. And it's not always going to be defined. It might be undefined if there's nothing wrong with the overall form. So the idea here is that inside of this form property, or I should say inside the array of strings, we're going to put errors that occur at kind of the form level. So errors like the user not being authenticated, or us just plain failing to save a topic into the database. The reason I'm putting on underscore form here is to just avoid accidentally colliding with any other field names that I might have inside of my form. So even though it's kind of unlikely, we might eventually have a form where one of the fields is called form. And I would not want to collide with that name, so that's why we are calling this underscore form. Again, very unlikely, but just kind of future-proofing here, just in case. So now, down inside of create topic, we can add a check inside of here to see if the user is logged in. And if they are not logged in, we can return an errors object that has that underscore form property assigned to it with an array of strings that says something like, please sign in. So here's how we would do that. To check and see if the user is logged in, at the very top of the file, we will import that auth function from our @/auth.js file. Then down here, after we do the initial validation on the user's input, I'm going to take a look at the user's session. So we'll say const session is await auth. And then if there is no session, or if session.user is not defined, so if there's no session or if there's no user, then I want to return early with my errors object having that underscore form property with an array that says you must be signed in to do this. So now back inside of our form, all we have to do is take this underscore form property out of our form state and display it on the screen if it is defined. So let's take a look at how we do that. Back over inside of topic create form, right above our button, we'll put in some curly braces, and it will say form state dot errors dot underscore form. And if that is defined, then I want to print out join with a comma and a space like so. So let's just get that error to display, and we'll worry about styling it in a moment after that. Okay, so now back over here, inside the browser, I am not signed in right now. Make sure you sign out as well. And if I put in a valid name and a valid description and click on submit, I will see you must be signed in to do this. Perfect. So now we can use this underscore form property to handle any kind of errors that might occur as we submit our form. It could be you must be signed in to do this, or maybe something like you don't have permission, or maybe something like failed to connect to database, or just generally any kind of feedback we want to provide to the user. Last thing we'll take care of is to just add in a little bit of better styling here. So I'm going to find our curly braces right there, and I think we'll just delete that and replace it with the form state.errors underscore form. So if that is defined, I want to put in a div, otherwise null. And on the div, I will print out inside there form state errors underscore form question mark join with that string. And then on the div itself, we can add in a class name, and we'll do a key-2, a BG red 200, a border, and a border red 400. Now if we save that, we end up with this in total. And back in the browser, we get something that looks like that. Maybe we should round out those borders a little bit. So we could put in an additional class name there of rounded. And I'd say that doesn't look great. It doesn't quite fit with the other validation styling we have, but at least it's good enough to get by. Okay, so making progress here. I know each of these steps is laborious, a lot of stuff going on, but as I mentioned just a moment ago, all this stuff is you kind of just figure out how to do it one time, and then in the future, we're really just going to refer back to the code we've already written before. It's just going to be the exact same stuff over and over again. Believe it or not, we are almost done with this form. All we have to do is take the data that we've already validated, save it into our database as a new topic, and then navigate the user over to the page where we show the topic on the screen. So let's get to it. Inside of our server action file, we're going to add in a couple of imports at the very top. I'm going to import the type of topic from @prisma/client. This right here is a type that describes exactly what a topic is inside of our application. So a topic is something that has an ID, a slug, that's its name. Remember, a slug is the URL safe version of a name. So our slug is basically the name that the user submitted in the form, and then a description and a created at and updated at. In order to create a topic, we only have to provide the slug, which again is the name, and the description. I'll show you why we are importing this type in just a moment. Then we're also going to import redirect from next/navigation. And then down here, we will import our database from @/db and that paths helper object from @/paths. We are importing that thing so we know exactly what path we're going to navigate the user to. Remember, we created that just to avoid having to type out all those strings and whatnot. Okay, so now, down towards the bottom of the file, right after we check to see if the user is logged in, I'm going to put in a try catch. Inside of the try, or I should say right above it, we're going to declare a variable with the let keyword. This is going to be our topic, and it's going to be of type topic. The whole reason that we are doing this is that, remember, later on, we want to call our redirect function. And when we call it redirect, we need to put in the path right here, and that is going to use the topic's ID. We don't know what the topic's ID is until we save it into the database. So we need to get access to the topic and pass it off to redirect. And the reason that we are not just calling redirect inside of here is because, remember, redirect works by throwing an error. So if we catch the error thrown by redirect, then we're never going to actually redirect to another page. So you're going to see this pattern of declaring a variable above with the let keyword, and then a try catch, and then calling redirect. You can see that very often in a Next project, or more specifically inside of a server action. Now inside the try, we'll make use of our database with await db.topic.create. We'll pass in some data, and our slug is going to be result data name. So where exactly is that coming from? Well, remember, when we did our validation with Zod, we got back that result object. And if the validation is successful, so if we get past this if statement right here, the actual validated data is available on the result.data property. So that's why we are doing result data name. And remember the slug, I've been using that term every now and then. It's a URL safe version of our name. So the name that we've been using here, it really is a slug. I've just been hesitant to use the word slug in this course because I feel like if you're not used to that word, it's really mysterious and confusing. And that's why, as we've been creating this form, I've just been calling it name. So I'm probably just making it more confusing than it needs to be by doing that, but the name is a slug. It's the same thing. Then our description, it's going to be results, data, description. And then we're going to take the result of this and assign it to that topic variable, again, so we can make use of it down here with our redirect. So we'll say topic is all that stuff. Then down here on the redirect, whenever we successfully create the topic, we want to take the user over to the topic show path. And that's where our path helper file comes in. So inside of source paths.ts, we had created that helper called topic show. And if we want to get the path that we'll use to navigate there, all we have to do is call topic show and put in the topic's slug. So in this case, we will call redirect and pass in paths.topicshow with topic.slug. And we are only getting an error right there because we have not added in any implementation for catch just yet. So let's take care of any errors that might occur. If any error does occur, we want to take the errors message and assign it to the underscore form property inside of this errors object, or really our form state. Remember, anything we put inside of that array and return is going to show up on the form. So that's a great place for us to tell the user, hey, sorry, but we failed to save your topic for some whatever reason. So inside of the catch, we will take a look at the error object and narrow down its type. So we'll do if error is an instance of an error object, then we can return a new form state, which will be errors with underscore form. That's going to be an array with error.message in it. We also need to handle the case in which this error is not an instance of error. So when it's just completely some totally unexpected value. So we'll put in an else, and in that case, return the errors object, the underscore form of something went wrong. So something that we just totally don't understand went wrong, and for some reason we did not throw an error about it, we threw some other kind of value. And that's just about it. So now, the very last thing we have to take care of, let's not forget our comment down here, we do have to revalidate the homepage. Let's just take care of that right away so we don't forget to revalidate that homepage. At the very top, we can import revalidate path from next/cache. And then at the bottom of the function, back down here, I'll remove the to do and replace it with revalidate path homepage. And that needs to be placed above the redirect. Remember, I just mentioned redirect throws an error. So as soon as we call redirect, nothing else inside of this function is going to be running. And that means that we actually no longer need the return statement down here anymore, because we're never going to get down to that line of code. Okay, so that's it. We should be at long last done with this form. So time to test it. I really have no idea if it's going to work or not. I sure hope it does. So I'll go back over. I'm going to make sure I'm logged in. I'm going to try to create a topic of JavaScript, and I'll say something like, this is a great place to discuss all things JavaScript. And I'll submit. And there we go. It actually worked. It appears to have worked. So I've navigated over to topic/JavaScript. I don't see any errors on the screen. And if I open up my terminal, I don't see any errors down here either. But we won't really know until we try to actually access this topic and show it on the screen in some way. Right now, this text of topic show is just hard-coded to be displayed. So there's no really inherent guarantee the topic has been created just yet, but I can tell you it has, without a doubt. It definitely worked. Otherwise, we would have seen an error. Now, I would like to test out an error really quickly around the stuff, just to show you what would happen. So back inside of create topic, there's our server action. Inside the try catch right here, before I create a record in the database, let's just throw an error of something like fail to create topic. So we're just going to pretend that something is going to go wrong with creating the topic by throwing an error manually. You'll notice I'm getting some TypeScript errors right there. Just ignore them, totally fine. We can still run this and get the error to throw, even with a TypeScript error. I'll then go back over to the home page. I'll create a topic. I'll add in some name, some description, and submit. And there we go. So we got our error to show up. So if anything goes wrong now with the entire topic creation process, the user enters in invalid input and adds the name or description. If they're not logged in, if we just fail to save the record into the database, no matter what, we got it covered. We're going to handle every kind of error possibly imaginable, and we throw it off on the form at the appropriate location. So like I said, yes, putting this together the first time, challenging. But this is it. This is like as solid a form as we can really possibly put together. And now we're just going to repeat this same process for the other two forms that we need to create. And trust me, those are going to go together much more easily. Now I'm going to make sure I clean up that throw an error right there and save the file. And we are all done with create topic. Hooray. So let's